Settle in and let your mind drift back nearly 2,000 years to a world where the roar of crowds echoed through stone amphitheaters, and where men trained daily for moments that would either elevate them to glory or end their lives entirely. Tonight, we journey not to the blood-soaked sands of the Colosseum during the height of spectacle, but to the quieter, more grinding reality that preceded those famous battles. You've likely imagined gladiators as they appeared in their final moments of triumph or defeat bronze-muscled warriors bathed in sunlight, crowds cheering, the drama of life and death playing out in grand theater. But before those moments of brutal poetry, there were years of something far less romantic. The daily grind of the ludus, the gladiator school, where men woke before dawn to the scent of leather and iron, where they learned to kill and be killed with methodical precision. Picture yourself walking through the narrow streets of ancient Rome, past the forums and temples, toward the outskirts where these schools operated. The air grows thicker as you move away from the marble magnificence of the city center, carrying with it the sounds of wooden swords striking shields, the grunts of exertion, the sharp commands of trainers who had once stood where their students now stand. The buildings were functional, austere, more prison than palace, more workshop than home. Here, in these courtyards surrounded by high walls, topped with iron spikes, ordinary men became instruments of entertainment, their bodies transformed through relentless routine into something both magnificent and disposable. The transformation was never sudden. A condemned criminal, a captured enemy, a desperate freeman selling himself into servitude, each arrived at the ludus as one thing and, if they survived, emerged as something entirely different. The process stripped away their former identities as surely as it stripped away their civilian clothes, replacing both with the singular purpose of survival through combat. Their days became measured not in hours, but in repetitions. How many times they could thrust a gladius into a training post before their arms gave out. How many circuits they could run around the practice arena before their legs betrayed them. How many blows they could absorb before their will finally cracked. The lanista, the owner and operator of each school, viewed his gladiators through the cold lens of investment and return. These men were livestock, expensive livestock, to be fed well enough to maintain their strength, trained rigorously enough to develop skill, but never allowed to forget that their value lay entirely in their ability to provide entertainment through violence. The most successful Laniste understood that the crowd craved not just blood, but artistry in the spilling of it. We'll begin in the ludus itself, where the rhythm of training shaped every waking hour, where the distinction between preparation and punishment often blurred beyond recognition. Then we'll witness the most famous moment of gladiatorial rebellion, when that carefully maintained routine finally shattered under the weight of accumulated resentment and desperate hope. We'll examine the deadly artistry of their weapons and techniques, understanding how instruments of death became extensions of their wielders' souls. And finally, we'll observe how some gladiators transcended their origins to dine at the tables of the very people who had once owned them, their celebrity transforming them from slaves into something far more complex and troubling. Let yourself sink into this ancient world, where survival demanded both physical prowess and psychological endurance, where each dawn brought the same question: would this be another day of training, or the day you finally stepped into the arena for real? Close your eyes and feel the rough wool of a gladiator's tunic against your skin. Smell the sawdust that absorbed the sweat and occasional blood of practice sessions. Hear the endless repetition of commands that would, with enough time, become as natural as breathing itself. The darkness before dawn in a gladiatorial school held a particular quality thick with the breath of sleeping men, heavy with the anticipation of another day's grinding routine. Imagine yourself awakening not to gentle sunlight or the soft sounds of a peaceful morning, but to the harsh clang of iron on iron as the guards struck their spears against the metal grating that served as windows. The sound echoed through the stone corridors, bouncing off walls that had absorbed years of similar awakenings, carrying with it the unspoken promise that this day like every day before it, would demand everything these men had to give. The sleeping quarters of a typical ludus resembled nothing so much as a military barracks crossed with a prison cell. Stone walls rose 12 feet high, their surfaces worn smooth by countless hands that had pressed against them in moments of desperation, frustration, or simple exhaustion. The floors were stone as well, covered with thin straw mattresses that provided little comfort, but served their purpose of keeping the gladiators off the cold ground. Each man was allocated roughly 6 feet of space enough to lie down, but not enough for privacy, not enough for dignity in the way free men understood it. You can picture them stirring in that gray pre-dawn light, perhaps 40 men in a single room, their bodies telling the story of their profession, even in sleep. Scars traced pale lines across dark skin, some from training accidents, others from actual combat. Muscles developed through specific repeated motions created bodies that were simultaneously powerful and strangely proportioned. Massive shoulders and forearms from wielding heavy weapons. Thick legs from the constant lateral movement required in the arena, but often bearing the gaunt look around the face that spoke to a diet calculated for strength rather than pleasure. The morning routine began before most of Rome had even considered waking. While citizens slept in beds, softened with down pillows and warmed by braziers, gladiators rose to face wooden swords and leather-wrapped training poles. The first meal of the day was barley porridge, thick and filling, but deliberately bland food as fuel, nothing more. They ate from wooden bowls with wooden spoons, utensils that could not be transformed into weapons. A constant reminder of their status as valuable, but ultimately untrustworthy property. The trainer, called the doctor, was often a former gladiator himself, someone who had survived long enough to earn his freedom and then chose to remain in the only world he truly understood. His voice carried the authority of experience as he called out the morning assignments. Watch him as he surveys his charges, noting who moves with the fluid confidence of experience and who still carries the stiffness of fear or inexperience. His weathered hands gesture toward different areas of the training ground, dividing the men according to their skills, their weapon specializations, their proximity to actual combat. The ludus itself was designed with the brutal efficiency of its purpose in mind. The central courtyard served as the primary training area, its packed earth surface carefully maintained to provide the right amount of give underfoot soft enough to prevent injury from falls, hard enough to simulate arena conditions. Wooden posts, called palus, stood at regular intervals throughout the space, their surfaces scarred and splintered from thousands of practice strikes. Each post was roughly the height and width of a man, allowing trainees to develop the muscle memory necessary for actual combat. Around the perimeter of the courtyard, specialized training areas catered to different fighting styles. The retiari, gladiators who fought with net and trident, practiced their casting and retrieval techniques in an area marked with chalk circles that simulated the constraints of arena combat. Their movements were fluid, almost dance-like, as they learned to use mobility and timing rather than brute force. The heavily armored secutors worked in a different area entirely. Their training focused on the patient, methodical combat style required when carrying 60 pounds of protective gear. The armory occupied a secure building adjacent to the main courtyard, its heavy wooden doors reinforced with iron bands and secured with locks that only the lanista and his most trusted assistants could open. Inside, weapons hung in careful rows according to type and condition. Practice weapons, wooden swords, leather-wrapped shields, blunted spear points filled most of the space, but in a locked inner chamber, the real instruments of death waited. These weapons were works of art in their way, forged by craftsmen who understood that a gladiator's life might depend on the balance of his blade or the distribution of weight in his shield. The smell of the ludus was distinctive, a combination of leather, metal, sweat, and the sawdust that was scattered across the training areas to absorb moisture and provide footing. Underneath these immediate scents lay others, the olive oil used to condition skin and leather, the vinegar that was mixed with water to create the gladiator's primary drink, the herbs that were burned in small braziers to ward off evil spirits or simply to mask less pleasant odors. Training began in earnest as the sun cleared the walls of the compound. The sound of wooden weapons striking wooden shields created a rhythm that would continue, with brief interruptions, until the sun began to set. New recruits, still soft from civilian life, struggled with the basic movements that veterans performed with unconscious precision. Watch as a trainer guides a new man's sword arm, showing him how to thrust from the core of his body rather than simply swinging his arm, how to keep his shield positioned to protect his vital organs while still maintaining mobility. The hierarchy within the ludus was rigid and immediately apparent to anyone who observed the morning routine. Veterans moved with confidence through spaces that newer gladiators approached hesitantly. They claimed the best positions at the communal eating areas, received the choicest cuts of the simple meals, and generally conducted themselves with the authority that came from having survived multiple arena appearances. New men watched them with mixtures of admiration, envy, and fear, understanding that these survivors possessed knowledge that might mean the difference between life and death. Physical conditioning occupied a significant portion of each training day. Gladiators were required to maintain peak physical condition, not just for their own survival, but because the crowd demanded athletes who could provide sustained entertainment. Running formed the foundation of this conditioning, not the long-distance running of messengers, but the quick sprints and lateral movement that arena combat required. Men ran in formation around the perimeter of the training ground, their breathing becoming rhythmic and controlled as their bodies adapted to the demands placed upon them. Strength training followed different principles than modern athletes might recognize, focusing entirely on the specific movements and muscle groups that gladiatorial combat required. Heavy wooden swords, twice the weight of their metal counterparts, built the shoulder and arm strength necessary to maintain weapon control throughout a long fight. Oversized shields developed the core strength needed to maintain defensive positioning while maneuvering for offensive opportunities. The psychological aspect of training was perhaps even more important than the physical conditioning, though it was rarely discussed explicitly. New gladiators had to be broken down and rebuilt, their civilian identities and moral frameworks stripped away and replaced with the mindset necessary for ritualized killing. This transformation was accomplished through a combination of relentless routine, social isolation from the outside world, and the gradual normalization of violence. Religious observance played a complex role in gladiatorial life. While gladiators were often denied access to traditional Roman religious practices, they developed their own relationships with the gods, particularly those associated with war and death. Small shrines appeared in corners of the sleeping quarters, decorated with offerings of food, wine, or small personal items. These served both as sources of comfort and as focal points for the superstitions that inevitably developed around activities where chance played such a significant role in survival. One marked by the careful observation of technique and the subtle negotiations of power that occurred between men who lived constantly on the edge of violence. The midday hours brought with them a heat that seemed to press down from above, while simultaneously radiating up from the packed earth of the training ground, creating an environment where every movement required additional effort, where sweat became as constant a companion as the wooden practice weapons that never left their hands. Imagine yourself standing in the shade of the colonnade that surrounded the main courtyard, watching as the doctor moves between groups of trainees with the measured pace of someone who has learned to conserve energy while maintaining absolute authority. His voice carries across the space, sometimes offering correction, sometimes praise, but always with the underlying tone of someone who understands that the difference between proper technique and sloppy execution might be measured in heartbeats when these men finally faced real opponents in the arena. The midday meal was served in the shade of the colonnade, a simple affair that nonetheless revealed much about the social structure within the ludus. Veterans claimed the choicest spots, their backs against the cool stone walls, while newer recruits found themselves in less comfortable positions. The food itself was carefully calculated to provide maximum nutrition, with minimum caustic stews of barley and vegetables, occasionally supplemented with small amounts of meat, bread that was coarse but filling, and always the mixture of water and vinegar that served as the gladiators' primary beverage. You can observe how the men arranged themselves during these brief respites, how natural leaders emerged, not through official appointment, but through the subtle recognition of competence and survival. The gladiator who had lived through 10 arena battles commanded respect that went far beyond his official rank within the school S hierarchy. His opinions on technique, his assessment of opponents, his advice on the psychological aspects of combat all were sought after and carefully considered by men who understood that his continued existence proved the value of his knowledge. The afternoon training sessions focused on specialized skills that went beyond basic weapon handling. This was when gladiators learned the theatrical aspects of their profession, the ways in which combat could be transformed into entertainment without necessarily sacrificing effectiveness. The crowd, after all, wanted to see artistry as well as brutality, and a gladiator who could provide both had a significantly better chance of surviving defeat than one who simply hacked away without style or grace. Pairs of gladiators would face off with practice weapons, their movements carefully supervised by trainers who understood that an injury during practice could represent a significant financial loss to the ludus. The sound of wooden swords striking leather-wrapped shields created a constant percussion, punctuated by the sharp commands of instructors and the occasional grunt of exertion from the combatants. The training partnerships that developed during these sessions often transcended the artificial bonds of the ludus, creating relationships that were part mentorship, part friendship, and part mutual survival pact. Veteran gladiators understood that their own longevity might depend on the quality of their training partners, and they invested time and effort in developing the skills of newer recruits. These relationships existed in a strange, moral spacemen who might genuinely care for each other as welfare, while simultaneously understanding that circumstances might eventually require them to fight each other to the death. The medical care provided within the ludus reflected the same practical calculations that governed every other aspect of gladiatorial life. A trained medicus, often a Greek slave with genuine medical knowledge, maintained a small infirmary where injuries could be treated and chronic conditions managed. The quality of this care was generally superior to what common citizens might receive, not out of any particular compassion for the gladiators' suffering, but because their bodies represented substantial investments that required maintenance. Massage and physical therapy were regular parts of the training routine, provided by slaves who specialized in maintaining the physical condition of athletes. These sessions served multiple purposes. They helped prevent injuries. They provided opportunities for the early detection of problems that might affect performance. And they served as a form of psychological comfort for men who were otherwise deprived of most forms of physical affection or gentle human contact. The afternoon hours also provided time for the more cerebral aspects of gladiatorial training. Experienced fighters would discuss strategy and tactics, analyzing the strengths and weaknesses of different fighting styles, sharing information about opponents they had faced or observed. These conversations took place in small groups, often during the brief rest periods between training sessions, and they represented a form of military intelligence gathering that could mean the difference between life and death. The lanista himself made regular appearances during the midday training, moving through the compound with the air of a man inspecting valuable livestock. His presence changed the dynamic of the training sessions, as gladiators understood that their performance during these visits might influence their future assignments. The lanista's eye was trained to spot potential, to identify gladiators who might develop into crowd favorites, and to assess the overall readiness of his fighters for upcoming games. The economics of gladiatorial training were never far from the surface of daily life within the ludus. Each gladiator represented a significant investment in purchase price, training costs, food, medical care, and equipment. The lanista's success depended on his ability to maximize the return on these investments, which meant producing fighters who could survive long enough to become profitable, while still providing the kind of spectacular entertainment that would ensure continued bookings. The psychological warfare that occurred within the ludus was subtle but constant. Gladiators learned to read each other's strengths and weaknesses, to identify the mental vulnerabilities that might be exploited in combat. This knowledge was power, but it was also dangerous. A man who revealed too much about his own fears or limitations might find that information used against him when he least expected it. The training weapons themselves were carefully designed to be both safe and effective for their intended purpose. Wooden swords were carved to match the weight and balance of their metal counterparts, but with edges that could bruise rather than cut. Shields were constructed of wood and leather rather than metal, reducing the risk of serious injury while still providing realistic training conditions. The weapons were maintained by specialized craftsmen who understood that even practice equipment could become dangerous if not properly cared for. The afternoon training sessions gradually gave way to a different kind of preparation, one that focused on the mental and spiritual aspects of combat. Gladiators would spend time in quiet contemplation, often sitting alone in whatever shade they could find, preparing themselves psychologically for the challenges that lay ahead. Some engaged in prayer or meditation, others in the kind of mental rehearsal that athletes have used throughout history to prepare for competition. The social dynamics within the ludus were complex and often contradictory. Men who had been thrown together by circumstance developed bonds that were simultaneously deep and fragile. They shared the unique experience of living constantly under the shadow of death, but they also competed with each other for the favor of their trainers, for better equipment, for more prestigious assignments. Trust was a luxury that few could afford completely. Yet without some level of mutual cooperation, survival became even more difficult. The physical transformation that occurred during gladiatorial training was dramatic and visible. Men who arrived at the ludus with the soft bodies of civilians or the lean frames of soldiers gradually developed the specific musculature required for arena combat. Their hands became calloused from gripping weapons, their bodies scarred from countless practice sessions, their movements marked by the particular blend of power and grace that characterized professional fighters. The evening hours brought with them a different kind of training, one that focused on endurance and the ability to maintain technique even when exhausted. Gladiators would continue their practice sessions well into the night, working by torchlight when necessary, understanding that their opponents in the arena would show no mercy for fatigue or weakness. The lanista's investment in oil for torches and the guards' overtime pay were justified by the knowledge that superior conditioning could mean the difference between profit and loss when his gladiators finally entered the arena. The rhythm of daily life in the ludus was punctuated by moments of violence that served as reminders of what lay ahead. Training accidents, while carefully avoided, were nonetheless inevitable when men practiced with weapons designed to simulate instruments of death. These incidents were handled with clinical efficiency, but they also served as sobering reminders of the consequences of carelessness or overconfidence. The night brought with it the only true privacy that gladiators could expect, the few hours when they could withdraw into themselves and confront the psychological challenges of their situation. Some men wrote letters to families they might never see again. Others simply lay in the darkness and tried to process the day's experiences. The quality of sleep in the ludus was generally poor, disrupted by anxiety, physical discomfort, and the constant awareness that each night might be among their last. The discipline within the ludus was maintained through a combination of positive incentives and harsh punishments. Gladiators who performed well in training received better food, more comfortable sleeping arrangements, and the possibility of advancement to more prestigious fighting styles. Those who failed to meet expectations faced reduced rations, additional training requirements, or in extreme cases, punishment that might include flogging or confinement in the ergastulum, the underground prison where the most troublesome slaves were kept. The gradual transformation of civilian into gladiator was perhaps most visible in the way men learned to move through space. The hypervigilance required for survival in combat gradually became second nature, creating individuals who were constantly aware of their surroundings, who automatically assessed potential threats, who moved with the controlled grace of predators. This transformation was necessary for survival, but it also created individuals who could never fully return to civilian life, even if they earned their freedom. As the sun began its descent toward the western walls of the ludus, casting long shadows across the training ground, the atmosphere within the compound underwent a subtle but unmistakable shift. The relentless energy of the day's training gave way to something more contemplative, more fragile, the recognition that each sunset brought these men one day closer to their eventual encounter with the arena's sand. The evening hours were when the psychological reality of gladiatorial life pressed most heavily upon those who lived it, when the routine that sustained them during daylight could no longer fully mask the uncertainty that defined their existence. Picture yourself observing the evening meal, served as the last light faded from the sky. The gladiators arranged themselves in their usual hierarchies, but their conversations carried a different tone than those of the morning or midday hours. There was an intimacy to these gatherings that spoke to the peculiar brotherhood forged by shared danger. Men who had spent the day practicing the techniques that might one day kill each other now shared simple meals and quiet conversation, their voices low and measured, as if speaking too loudly might somehow invite the attention of the fates. The food served at evening was often slightly better than the utilitarian fare of earlier meals, not out of any particular generosity on the part of the lanista, but because the evening meal served important psychological functions that justified the additional expense. A piece of meat with the evening's barley, a cup of wine mixed with water instead of vinegar perhaps, even a small sweet cake on special occasions. These minor luxuries helped maintain morale among men whose primary value lay in their willingness to risk death for the entertainment of others. The evening training sessions were different in character from those conducted during the heat of the day. As torches were lit around the perimeter of the training ground, gladiators engaged in forms of practice that were more meditative, more focused on the perfection of technique rather than the development of brute strength. This was when master gladiators worked individually with promising students, when the subtle aspects of combat that could not be taught to groups were passed down through direct instruction and careful observation. Watch as a veteran Retiarius demonstrates the precise wrist motion required to cast a net effectively, his movements fluid and economical despite the dim light. His student attempts to mirror the technique, failing repeatedly, but gradually beginning to understand the rhythm and timing that make the difference between a clumsy fisherman's throw and the precise cast of a hunting predator. These individual lessons were privileges earned through demonstrated commitment and skill, opportunities that newer gladiators observed with undisguised envy. The armory remained locked during the evening hours, but the presence of real weapons nearby seemed to exert a psychological influence on the night's activities. Gladiators would often gather around the practice weapons after the evening meal, handling them with a familiarity that spoke to thousands of hours of repetitive training. Their hands moved over the wooden surfaces with the unconscious certainty of lovers exploring familiar territory, checking for new splits in the wood, adjusting leather wrappings, ensuring that their tools were ready for the next day's work. The medical examinations that took place during the evening hours were more thorough than the quick assessments conducted during active training periods. The ludus medicus would move systematically through the ranks of gladiators, checking for signs of developing problems that might affect performance, treating minor injuries before they could become major ones, and assessing the overall condition of the lanista's investment. These examinations were conducted with clinical efficiency, but they also provided one of the few forms of gentle human contact that gladiators regularly experienced. The psychological preparation that occurred during the evening hours was perhaps more important than any physical training. Gladiators developed personal rituals and superstitions that helped them cope with the uncertainty of their profession. Some would spend time polishing their practice weapons to a shine that served no practical purpose but provided psychological comfort. Others engaged in elaborate grooming rituals, caring for their bodies with an attention to detail that might seem vain, but actually represented a form of self-respect that was essential for maintaining sanity in their circumstances. The letters that gladiators wrote during the evening hours were often the most honest documents they ever produced. Written by flickering torchlight, addressed to family members they might never see again, these messages revealed the emotional cost of gladiatorial life in ways that no external observer could fully appreciate. The literate gladiators often served as scribes for their illiterate companions, creating a form of intimacy and trust that transcended the usual hierarchies of the ludus. You can imagine the quiet conversations that took place in the shadows of the sleeping quarters as men prepared for another night of uncertain rest. Veterans would share stories of their arena experiences, not the boastful tales they might tell during daylight hours, but the more honest accounts of fear overcome, of moments when death had seemed certain, of the strange mixture of terror and exhilaration that came with surviving combat. These stories served multiple purposes. They provided psychological preparation for newer gladiators. They allowed veterans to process their own experiences, and they created the oral tradition that preserved the culture of gladiatorial combat. The religious observances that took place during the evening hours were more personal and intense than the perfunctory rituals of other times. Gladiators would approach their small shrines with offerings saved from their evening meals, whispering prayers to gods who might or might not be listening, engaging in the kind of bargaining with divine powers that desperate men have practiced throughout history. The gods they prayed to were often not the official deities of Rome, but older, more primitive powers associated with war, death, and the protection of warriors. The Lanista's evening rounds through the compound served both security and psychological purposes. His presence reminded the gladiators of their status as valuable property, but it also provided a form of paternal oversight that many of these men had been deprived of by the circumstances that brought them to the ludus. A word of encouragement from the Lanista, recognition of improvement in training, or even simple acknowledgement of a gladiator's efforts could provide motivation that lasted for days. The night guards who took over security duties as darkness fell were often former gladiators themselves, men who had earned their freedom but chose to remain within the familiar confines of the ludus. Their presence served as both promise and warning promise that survival was possible, that freedom could be earned, but also warning of how difficult it was for former gladiators to find their place in the wider world. The sounds of the ludus at night were distinctive and oddly comforting to those who lived there. The quiet conversations that continued well past the official bedtime, the occasional clank of metal as guards made their rounds, the rustle of straw as men shifted on their simple mattresses, the distant sounds of the city beyond the walls, all combined to create an atmosphere that was simultaneously peaceful and tense, like the calm before a storm that everyone knew was coming, but no one could predict. The dreams that came to gladiators during their few hours of sleep were often vivid and disturbing, filled with images of combat, death, and the crowds that would ultimately judge their performance. Veterans learned to wake quietly from nightmares, understanding that showing weakness or fear could be interpreted as a lack of readiness for combat. The ability to maintain composure even in sleep became another skill that gladiators had to master. The gradual quieting of the compound as men settled into sleep was marked by the sound of individual gladiators engaging in their personal evening rituals. Some would recite prayers or incantations. Others would perform physical exercises designed to promote restful sleep, and a few would simply lie in the darkness, and contemplate the choices and circumstances that had brought them to this place. The night hours were when the reality of their situation pressed most heavily upon new gladiators. Removed from the distractions of training and communal meals, alone with their thoughts in the darkness, they had to confront the full implications of their new lives. Some broke during these night hours, weeping quietly into their thin blankets or pacing restlessly through the shadows of the sleeping quarters. Others found a kind of peace and acceptance, embracing their fate with the stoicism that Roman culture valued above most other virtues. The dawn that would eventually come would bring another day identical in structure to the one just ended. But the evening hours served as a reminder that each day was also unique, irreplaceable, and possibly final. This tension between routine and uncertainty, between the mundane details of daily life and the extraordinary nature of their profession, created the psychological landscape in which gladiators lived. It was a landscape that required tremendous mental strength to navigate, and not all who entered it were equal to the challenge. The bonds formed during these quiet evening hours often proved stronger than those created during the intensity of training. Men who shared their fears, their memories, their hopes for an uncertain future in the intimate darkness of the sleeping quarters developed relationships that transcended the artificial hierarchies of the ludus. These relationships provided the emotional support necessary for survival, but they also created additional psychological burdens, as gladiators understood that the arena might eventually require them to fight and possibly kill men they had come to regard as brothers. As the compound settled into the relative quiet of night, with only the guards remaining fully alert, the ludus took on the atmosphere of a military camp on the eve of battle. There was purpose in this quiet, preparation in this rest, and beneath it all, the constant awareness that tomorrow would bring another day of training for a contest where the stakes could not be higher. In this environment, sleep became not just a physical necessity, but a form of courage, the willingness to surrender consciousness despite the uncertainty of what the next day might bring. The morning of the escape dawned much like any other in the ludus of Lentulus Batiatus, situated in the shadow of Mount Vesuvius near the prosperous city of Capua. The year was 73 BCE, and the Roman Republic was at the height of its power, its legions conquering distant lands, while its citizens enjoyed the fruits of empire. Within the walls of the gladiatorial school, however, a different kind of power was about to manifest itself, the power of desperate men, who had finally reached the limits of what they could endure. Imagine yourself walking through the pre-dawn corridors of that particular ludus, feeling the weight of accumulated tension that had been building for months, perhaps years. The air itself seemed different that morning, though none but the most perceptive observers would have noticed the change. It carried with it the same familiar sense of leather and iron, sweat and sawdust. But underneath these everyday odors lay something else, the sharp, metallic taste of anticipation, the kind that precedes storms or battles or moments when history pivots on decisions made by ordinary people pushed beyond their breaking point. Spartacus himself moved through the morning routine with the same measured precision that had characterized his behavior for the 2 years since his arrival at the school. To casual observers, he appeared to be simply another Thracian gladiator, perhaps more skilled than most, certainly more thoughtful in his approach to training, but nothing that would have suggested the transformation that was about to occur. His fellow gladiators saw something different, however, a quality of attention, a way of watching and listening that suggested depths beneath the surface compliance. The Thracian-esque background was itself a study in the complex pathways that led men to the gladiatorial schools. He had been a soldier, possibly a deserter from the Roman auxiliary forces, though the exact details of his military service remained unclear even to those who fought beside him. What was certain was that he possessed the kind of tactical thinking that came from experience with large-scale military operations, combined with the personal combat skills that had kept him alive through multiple arena appearances. This combination of strategic vision and individual prowess would prove crucial in the events that were about to unfold. The morning training session proceeded with the usual routines, but careful observers might have noticed subtle changes in the way certain gladiators positioned themselves within the training ground. Small groups that normally trained in different areas found reasons to work closer together. Conversations that usually flowed freely became more guarded, punctuated by meaningful glances and half-finished sentences. The veteran gladiators moved with a purposefulness that went beyond their usual professional competence, while newer trainees seemed somehow more alert, more attentive to the subtle currents of communication that flowed beneath the surface of daily routine. Lentulus Batiatus himself was not present that morning, having traveled to Rome on business related to upcoming games. His absence was not unusual successful. Lannister often had multiple interests and responsibilities that required their attention, but it represented one of the crucial factors that made the day's events possible. The school's security was left in the hands of his trusted overseer, a former gladiator named Marcus, who had earned his freedom through years of successful combat, but who perhaps had grown complacent in his role as guardian of other men's streams of freedom. The kitchen that morning prepared the usual fair barley porridge, coarse bread, and the diluted wine that served as the gladiators' primary beverage. But hidden among the usual cooking implements, carefully concealed from the casual inspection of guards, were items that had been gradually accumulated over weeks of careful planning. Kitchen knives, normally kept under strict control, had been secretly duplicated using metalworking skills that some gladiators had possessed before their enslavement. Wooden spoons had been sharpened into crude but effective stabbing weapons. Even the heavy iron cooking pots could serve as clubs in desperate hands. The conspiracy that was about to unfold had been months in the making, growing from casual conversations about freedom into something approaching a military operation. The core group of conspirators numbered perhaps 20 men, drawn from different ethnic backgrounds, but united by their refusal to accept that their current situation represented the entirety of their future. Spartacus had emerged as their natural leader not through any formal selection process, but through the kind of organic recognition of competence that occurs when desperate people identify someone capable of transforming their desperation into action. The signal for the uprising came during the midday meal, delivered through a system of subtle gestures and carefully timed movements that had been practiced and refined over weeks of preparation. A dropped wooden bowl, apparently by accident, rolling across the stone floor in a specific pattern. A particular way of stretching and yawning that indicated readiness. The casual repositioning of men throughout the dining area so that the guards found themselves outnumbered and isolated without realizing how their tactical situation had been compromised. The actual moment of violence, when it came, was swift and decisive. The kitchen utensils that had been secreted throughout the dining area appeared in gladiatorial hands with a kind of coordinated precision that spoke to careful planning and military discipline. The guards, accustomed to passive compliance of well-fed slaves, found themselves facing men who had been trained for years in the arts of combat, and who were now applying those skills with the desperate energy of people fighting for their freedom. The sounds of the initial confrontation echoed through the stone corridors of the ludus, but they were not immediately recognizable as the sounds of rebellion. The clash of metal on metal, the shouts of command and confusion, the running footsteps, all could have been attributed to a training accident or a disciplinary incident. This confusion bought the rebels precious time to secure their initial objectives and to arm themselves with more effective weapons than kitchen implements. The armory, that locked chamber where the real weapons of gladiatorial combat were stored, became the rebels' primary objective once the initial phase of the uprising had succeeded. The heavy wooden doors, reinforced with iron bands and secured with massive locks, had been designed to keep gladiators away from the instruments of death. But they had not been designed to withstand the determined assault of men who understood that these weapons represented their only hope of transforming a desperate prison break into something approaching a real chance at freedom. The breaking open of the armory doors marked the moment when a spontaneous uprising transformed into something resembling a military operation. Suddenly, men who had been armed with crude improvised weapons found themselves holding the tools of their trade real swords with edges, sharp enough to cut through leather and flesh shields that could actually protect rather than merely cushion blow spears with points designed to pierce armor and find vital organs. The psychological transformation that accompanied this change in armament was as significant as the tactical advantage it provided. Spartacus's military experience became crucial during these first hours of the rebellion. While other gladiators might have been content to fight their way out of the ludus and disappear into the countryside as individual fugitives, he understood that their only hope of long-term survival lay in maintaining unit cohesion and following a strategic plan that went beyond immediate escape. His voice could be heard throughout the compound, not shouting with the wild enthusiasm of sudden freedom, but speaking with the calm authority of a commander organizing his troops for a difficult campaign. The speed with which news of the uprising spread through the local area reflected both the efficiency of Roman communication systems and the underlying tensions that existed throughout the slave-holding regions of southern Italy. Within hours of the initial breakout, riders were carrying word to magistrates in nearby cities, while local landowners began taking defensive measures to protect their own human property. The rebellion that had begun as a desperate bid for personal freedom was about to become a much larger phenomenon, one that would challenge the fundamental assumptions upon which Roman society was built. The rebels' initial success in overcoming the ludus guards and arming themselves was only the beginning of their challenges. They now faced the much more difficult task of transforming themselves from individual gladiators into a coherent military force, capable of surviving in a hostile countryside while being pursued by the professional soldiers of the Roman legions. The skills that had kept them alive in the arena would serve them well in the trials ahead, but they would need to develop new capabilities: scouting, logistics, siege warfare, and above all the ability to inspire other oppressed people to join their cause. The immediate hours following the breakout from the ludus of Lentulus Batiatus unfolded with a mixture of careful planning and desperate improvisation that would characterize the entire rebellion. As the sun reached its zenith on that fateful day in 73 BCE, the small band of escaped gladiators found themselves facing the fundamental question that confronts all successful prison breaks. What comes next? For most escaped slaves, the answer would have been simple: disappear into the countryside, adopt new identities, and hope to avoid recapture. But Spartacus and his companions had larger ambitions, ones that would transform a local incident into a challenge to the very foundations of Roman power. Picture the scene as the rebels emerged from the walls of the ludus, perhaps 70 or 80 men, strong, carrying weapons they had claimed from the armory, but still dressed in the simple tunics that marked their status as gladiators. The countryside around Capua stretched before them, rolling hills covered with the vineyards and olive groves that made this region one of the most prosperous in all of Italy. The landscape itself seemed peaceful, almost pastoral, but the rebels understood that this tranquility was deceptive. Every farm they could see was worked by slave labor, every villa housed a Roman citizen who viewed human bondage as the natural order of things, and every road led eventually to a garrison town where soldiers waited to respond to exactly the kind of emergency they now represented. The first strategic decision faced by the rebels was where to establish their initial base of operations. Running blindly through the countryside would only lead to their eventual capture and execution. They needed a defensible position, one that would allow them to rest, organize, and plan their next moves while being protected from immediate Roman retaliation. Spartacus's military experience proved invaluable in this decision, as he recognized the tactical advantages offered by Mount Vesuvius, the volcanic peak that dominated the local landscape. The mountain that would become famous nearly 2 centuries later for burying Pompeii in ash and lava was then simply a formidable natural fortress. Its slopes steep enough to discourage casual assault, but not so precipitous as to prevent the movement of determined men. More importantly, Vesuvius offered multiple escape routes and enough natural resources to support a growing band of fugitives. Springs provided fresh water. The lower slopes offered grazing for livestock that could be raided from nearby farms. And the dense vegetation provided both concealment and materials for constructing temporary shelters. The journey from the Ludus to Vesuvius took place under cover of darkness, with the rebels moving in small groups to avoid detection. Their passage through the countryside was marked by a series of carefully planned raids on isolated farms and villas, operations that served multiple purposes beyond simple acquisition of supplies. Each successful raid demonstrated to the local slave population that Roman authority was not absolute, that resistance was possible, and that the rebels possessed both the capability and the will to challenge their master's power. You can imagine the psychological impact of these early raids on both the raiders and their victims. For the escaped gladiators, each successful operation built confidence and provided practical experience in the kind of warfare they would need to master if they hoped to survive as a fighting force. They learned to move silently through unfamiliar terrain, to coordinate attacks on multiple objectives simultaneously, and to withdraw quickly before Roman forces could respond effectively. These were skills that the arena had not taught them, but which their lives now depended upon mastering. The slaves they encountered during these raids presented the rebels with both opportunities and challenges. Many were eager to join what they saw as a chance for freedom, but their addition to the band brought logistical complications that tested the rebels' organizational abilities. Former gladiators were accustomed to the discipline and efficiency of the ludus, where every aspect of daily life was carefully regulated. Suddenly, they found themselves responsible for organizing and feeding a growing crowd of people who lacked military training, who came from different cultural backgrounds, and who had varying degrees of commitment to the dangerous path the rebellion represented. The Roman response to the initial breakout was characterized by the kind of bureaucratic delay and underestimation that would plague their efforts throughout the early stages of the rebellion. Local magistrates sent messages to Rome describing what they assumed was a minor incident involving escaped slaves, hardly the kind of emergency that required immediate attention from the central government. The initial military response was correspondingly modest, a small force of local militia and urban cohorts, commanded by officials who viewed the assignment as more of a police action than a military campaign. This Roman complacency played directly into Spartacus's strategic planning. Each day that passed without serious Roman intervention allowed the rebels to grow stronger, to improve their organization, and to extend their influence over a wider area. The former gladiator's understanding of Roman military doctrine told him that this period of relative safety would be temporary, that eventually the full weight of Roman military power would be brought to bear against them. But for now, time was their ally, and they used it effectively to transform themselves from escaped slaves into something approaching a real army. The establishment of the rebel camp on the slopes of Vesuvius marked a crucial transition in the nature of the uprising. What had begun as a desperate prison break was evolving into something that historians would later recognize as a genuine revolutionary movement. The camp itself was organized along military lines, with designated areas for different functions, weapon storage and maintenance, food preparation and distribution, medical care for the wounded, and training areas where new recruits could be taught the basics of combat and military discipline. The leadership structure that emerged during this period reflected both the practical necessities of military organization and the complex dynamics of a movement that brought together people from vastly different backgrounds. Spartacus was recognized as the overall commander, but he was supported by lieutenants who brought their own skills and followings to the rebellion. Crixus, a Gallic gladiator, commanded the loyalty of many of the Celtic warriors who had joined the movement. Enemos, another Gaul, served as a military tactician who whose understanding of Roman weak points proved invaluable in planning operations. The daily routine of the rebel camp bore some resemblance to life in the ludus, but with crucial differences that reflected their new status as free men fighting for a cause they believed in. Training sessions continued, but now they focused on the skills needed for guerrilla warfare rather than arena combat. Men who had spent years learning to fight as individuals now had to master the coordination required for unit tactics. The disciplined formations that Roman soldiers took for granted had to be taught to fighters who were accustomed to the more individualistic combat of the gladiatorial arena. The psychological transformation that occurred during this period was as significant as the military one. Men who had lived their entire adult lives as property of others now found themselves making decisions about strategy, logistics, and the fundamental direction of their movement. The experience of agency, of being able to choose their own actions rather than simply responding to the commands of others, was intoxicating and terrifying in equal measure. Some thrived in this environment of radical freedom, while others found themselves paralyzed by the weight of responsibility they had never been asked to bear. The raids that the rebels conducted from their mountain stronghold became increasingly sophisticated as their numbers grew and their experience accumulated. What had begun as desperate foraging expeditions evolved into carefully planned military operations, designed to achieve specific strategic objectives. Supply raids targeted Roman granaries and weapon depots, providing the rebels with the resources they needed to sustain their growing force. Recruitment raids focused on large slave-worked estates, where the rebels' mere presence was often enough to trigger mass defections from the Roman cause. The propaganda value of these operations was as important as their material benefits. Each successful raid demonstrated that Roman power was not invincible, that organized resistance could achieve meaningful victories against the masters who had seemed untouchable. Stories of rebel successes spread throughout the slave communities of southern Italy, carried by escaped slaves, sympathetic free persons, and the Roman authorities themselves, who found themselves forced to acknowledge the growing threat through their own defensive preparations. The Romans' gradual recognition of the seriousness of the situation led to increasingly aggressive countermeasures. The initial response of local militia gave way to the deployment of regular legionary forces, commanded by officers who understood that their reputations depended on quickly suppressing what was becoming an embarrassing challenge to Roman authority. But the rebels had used their initial period of freedom effectively, transforming themselves from a desperate band of escaped slaves into a disciplined military force capable of meeting Roman soldiers on something approaching equal terms. The mountain stronghold of Vesuvius became a symbol of possibility for oppressed people throughout the Roman world. Here was proof that slaves could organize, fight, and win against their masters, that the Roman military machine was not invincible, and that freedom was something that could be seized rather than simply hoped for. The psychological impact of this demonstration extended far beyond the immediate participants in the rebellion, inspiring similar uprisings in other parts of Italy and creating a climate of unease among slaveholders throughout the empire. The transformation of Spartacus' rebellion from a local uprising into a war that threatened the very heart of Roman power unfolded over the course of nearly 3 years, from 73 to 71 BCE. What had begun as a desperate escape from a gladiatorial school evolved into a conflict that would engage some of Rome's most capable military commanders and expose fundamental weaknesses in the Roman approach to managing their vast population of enslaved people. The story of this transformation is one of tactical brilliance, strategic vision, and ultimately, the tragic limitations that constrained even the most successful challenges to Roman authority. Imagine yourself observing the rebel army as it descended from the slopes of Vesuvius in the spring of 72 BCE, now numbering in the tens of thousands, rather than the few dozen who had originally escaped from the ludus. The force that emerged from winter quarters bore little resemblance to the desperate band of escaped gladiators who had first sought refuge on the mountain. They moved with the disciplined coordination of veteran soldiers, their equipment captured from defeated Roman forces. Their confidence built through a series of victories that had established their reputation throughout southern Italy. The growth of the rebel army during its first year of operations represented one of the most remarkable military achievements in ancient history. Starting with perhaps 70 escaped gladiators, Spartacus had managed to attract and organize a force that some contemporary sources estimated at over 100,000 followers. This expansion was not simply a matter of desperate slaves flocking to any banner that promised freedom. It reflected the rebels' success in creating an organization capable of integrating diverse populations into an effective fighting force. The composition of Spartacus's army revealed the complex demographics of slavery in Roman Italy. The core remained the gladiators and other professional fighters who had provided the military expertise necessary for the rebellion's initial success. Around this nucleus gathered agricultural slaves from the great estates of southern Italy, many of whom brought knowledge of local terrain and Roman defensive arrangements. Urban slaves contributed different skills, literacy, craftsmanship, and familiarity with Roman administrative practices that proved invaluable in organizing the rebel war effort. The military campaigns that established Spartacus's reputation as a commander worthy of comparison with Rome's greatest generals began with his masterly handling of the first serious Roman attempt to suppress the rebellion. Praetor Claudius Glaber, confident that his professional soldiers could easily overwhelm a rabble of escaped slaves, made the classic mistake of underestimating his opponent. His decision to blockade the rebels on Vesuvius, cutting off their escape routes while starving them into submission, demonstrated a fundamental misunderstanding of both the terrain and the resourcefulness of the men he faced. The rebel response to this blockade became one of the most famous tactical maneuvers in military history. Rather than accepting the siege or attempting a costly frontal assault on the Roman positions, Spartacus ordered his men to weave ropes from wild vines growing on the mountain slopes. Using these improvised climbing aids, the rebels descended the supposedly impassable cliffs on the unguarded side of the mountain, circled around behind the Roman positions, and launched a surprise attack that routed Glaber's forces completely. The psychological impact of this victory extended far beyond its immediate military consequences, demonstrating that Roman tactical doctrine could be overcome by superior intelligence and unconventional thinking. The defeats of successive Roman commanders, first Glaber, then Praetor Publius Varinius, established a pattern that would characterize much of the rebellion. Roman forces, trained for conventional warfare against foreign enemies, struggled to adapt to the fluid, guerrilla-style tactics that Spartacus employed. The rebels avoided set-piece battles when possible, preferring to strike quickly at vulnerable targets before withdrawing to positions where their superior knowledge of local terrain gave them decisive advantages. The strategic vision that Spartacus displayed during the rebellion's expansion phase revealed the depth of his understanding of Roman weaknesses and his own force's capabilities. Rather than simply raiding for supplies and then retreating, he implemented a comprehensive campaign designed to undermine Roman authority throughout southern Italy. The winter of 73 to 72 BCE marked a crucial period in the rebellion's development. Encamped in the mountains of southern Italy, the rebel army used the respite from active campaigning to address the organizational challenges that came with their rapid growth. The integration of tens of thousands of new recruits required the development of new command structures, training programs, and logistical systems. Spartacus and his lieutenants worked to transform their diverse following into something approaching a professional army, capable of sustained operations against increasingly determined Roman opposition. The religious and cultural dimensions of the rebellion during this period reflected the complex identities of the people who had joined Spartacus' cause. While the movement was fundamentally about freedom from slavery, it also became a vehicle for expressing cultural identities that Roman conquest had suppressed. Gallic warriors brought their own traditions of warfare and leadership. Germanic tribesmen contributed their experience with forest fighting, and Greeks added their knowledge of military engineering and siege warfare. This cultural diversity was both a strength and a potential source of division within the rebel ranks. The Roman response to the rebellion's success underwent significant evolution as the magnitude of the threat became apparent. What had initially been treated as a police matter gradually received the attention appropriate to a major military crisis. The assignment of both consuls for 72 BC, Gellius and Lentulus, to suppress the rebellion marked Rome's recognition that they faced an enemy worthy of their most serious efforts. The resources committed to this campaign represented a substantial drain on Roman military capabilities at a time when the empire faced challenges on multiple fronts. The tactical innovations that emerged from the conflict between Roman legions and rebel forces influenced military thinking for generations. Spartacus's use of mobility to offset Roman advantages in equipment and training became a model for future insurgent movements. His integration of different fighting styles, gladiatorial techniques, tribal warfare traditions, and conventional military tactics created a synthesis that proved remarkably effective against opponents who expected to face more predictable enemies. The economic impact of the rebellion extended throughout Roman Italy, disrupting agricultural production, interfering with trade routes, and creating uncertainty that affected markets as far away as Rome itself. The liberation of agricultural slaves meant that many of the great estates that formed the backbone of the Roman economy could not function normally. The rebels' control of major roads and their ability to strike at commercial centers created a climate of economic instability that reinforced the political pressure on Roman authorities to end the uprising quickly. The internal dynamics of the rebel movement during its period of greatest success revealed both the strengths and weaknesses that would ultimately determine its fate. Spartacus's leadership was accepted by most of his followers, but significant disagreements emerged over strategic objectives. Some elements within the army favored a march on Rome itself, believing that a direct assault on the capital might trigger a general slave uprising throughout the empire. Others preferred to focus on consolidating control over southern Italy, creating a permanent free territory that could serve as a refuge for escaped slaves from throughout the Roman world. The decision that would ultimately prove fatal to the rebellion was made during the summer of 72 BCE, when Spartacus chose to lead his army northward toward the Alps and the possibility of escape from Italy entirely. This strategic withdrawal reflected his realistic assessment of the rebellion's long-term prospects. While they had achieved remarkable tactical successes, the fundamental balance of power remained heavily in Rome's favor. The Roman capacity to replace defeated armies and recruit new commanders was virtually unlimited, while the rebels' resources were necessarily finite. The march northward became an epic of endurance and military skill that took the rebel army through the heart of Roman Italy. They defeated the consular armies sent against them, captured and sacked numerous cities, and demonstrated their ability to operate effectively in any terrain. Yet even as these victories accumulated, the strategic situation was gradually shifting against them. Rome's determination to end the rebellion was hardening, and the appointment of Marcus Licinius Crassus to supreme command marked the beginning of a more systematic and ruthless approach to suppressing the uprising. The tragic denouement of the rebellion, when it finally came, reflected both the achievements and limitations of Spartacus's remarkable enterprise. The defeat of the rebel army in 71 BC ended not just a military campaign but a dream of freedom that had inspired the oppressed throughout the Roman world. Yet the impact of the rebellion extended far beyond its immediate participants, influencing Roman policies toward slavery, military organization, and the management of internal security threats that would shape the empire's development for centuries to come. The first sensation is always the smell. Iron and sweat, mixed with the earthy dampness of stone walls, that have absorbed decades of human effort and fear. You open your eyes in the dim light, filtering through narrow windows, and immediately you understand that this is not a place designed for comfort. The Ludus the Gladiator School announces itself through your senses before your mind has fully awakened. Imagine yourself lying on a thin straw mattress, one of dozens arranged in neat rows along the walls of a long, rectangular chamber. The ceiling is low, barely 8 feet above you, supported by thick wooden beams that have darkened with age and moisture. The walls are rough-hewn stone, unadorned except for the occasional iron ring driven deep into the mortar reminders that this is fundamentally a prison. Yet it's a prison with a purpose, a place where the condemned, the desperate, and the ambitious come to transform themselves into something Rome both fears and craves. The air is thick with the breath of sleeping men. 40, perhaps 50 bodies packed into a space meant for fewer, each one a story of circumstance, choice, or misfortune. To your left sleeps a Germanic tribesman, his blonde hair now cropped short in the Roman style, his massive frame somehow diminished by the chains around his ankles. To your right, a slight Syrian whose quick eyes and scarred hands speak of a life lived on the edges of society. Beyond him, a former Roman legionnaire who chose the ludus over execution for desertion. And next to him, a young man from Gaul whose smooth face suggests he hasn't yet faced his first real combat. The first sound of the day cuts through the thick air like a blade, the sharp crack of a wooden staff against iron bars. It's the signal you've learned to dread and anticipate in equal measure. The dormitory master, a scarred veteran whose own arena days ended with a crippling leg wound, moves through the sleeping quarters with the methodical precision of a man who has performed this ritual thousands of times. "Up, dogs," he calls, his voice carrying just enough volume to rouse the sleepers without descending into shouting. The sand waits for no one. You rise slowly, your body protesting the hard bed and the previous day's training. Around you, the dormitory comes alive with the quiet sounds of men preparing for another day of controlled violence. There's no conversation. Speech is discouraged in the early morning hours, part of the discipline that governs every aspect of life in the ludus. Instead, you listen to the whisper of fabric against skin as men dress in their simple tunics, the soft scrape of sandals on stone, the muffled coughs and sighs of bodies reluctantly returning to wakefulness. The morning routine is invariable, carved into the day like words into stone. First, the brief ablutions at the communal wash basins, cold water that shocks your system into full alertness, harsh soap that strips away the previous day's sweat and grime. The mirrors are polished bronze, distorting your reflection into something unfamiliar and strange. You study your face in the wavering surface, noting how the weeks of training have already begun to change you. Your cheekbones are more prominent, your jaw more defined, your eyes holding a wariness that wasn't there before. Then comes the morning meal, taken in the refectory, a long, low-ceilinged hall where wooden tables stretch in orderly rows. The food is simple but substantial. Barley porridge enriched with olive oil, coarse bread still warm from the ovens, diluted wine that tastes of resin and compromise. It's the diet of working men, designed to build muscle and endurance rather than provide pleasure. You eat in silence, surrounded by the sounds of wooden spoons scraping against ceramic bowls, the quiet mechanical process of fueling bodies that will soon be pushed to their limits. The gladiators around you eat with the focused intensity of men who understand that every meal might be their last good one. Some have been here for years, their bodies bearing the accumulated scars of countless training sessions and actual combats. Others are new like yourself, still adjusting to the rhythm of this strange existence. But all share the same expression as they eat, a kind of inward concentration, as if they're not just consuming food, but preparing their very souls for the day ahead. As the meal concludes, you file out into the central courtyard of the ludus, and here the true character of your new world reveals itself. The training ground is a rectangle of packed sand, perhaps 60 feet long and 40 feet wide, surrounded by covered walkways and observation galleries. The sand is not the clean, white sand of a beach, but a mixture of earth and grit that has been watered and raked smooth. Dark stains mark certain areas' old blood that has seeped deep enough to resist the daily cleaning. The morning sun slants through the columns, creating patterns of light and shadow that will shift throughout the day like a sundial, marking the hours of training. Your instructor is a man called Doctor, though you suspect this isn't his real name. He's a former gladiator himself, his retirement earned through skill and longevity rather than defeat. His left arm bears the distinctive scar of a trident wound, and he walks with the slight limp of a man whose right knee was shattered by a mace and never quite healed properly. Yet despite these marks of past violence, there's something almost paternal in his demeanor as he surveys his charges. Form ranks, he calls, and 40 men arrange themselves in neat rows across the sand. Today, like every day, we begin with the fundamentals. The training begins with exercises designed to build the specific kind of strength and endurance needed for arena combat. These aren't the flowing, graceful movements of a dancer, but the brutal, repetitive motions of men learning to kill and avoid being killed. You start with wooden posts driven deep into the sand, the palus, the foundation of all gladiator training. Imagine yourself standing before one of these posts, a wooden practice sword called a rudis in your right hand, a heavy shield on your left arm. The post is about the height of a man, wrapped in straw and leather to absorb the impact of your strikes. It's scarred and battered from countless training sessions, dark with sweat and marked with the frustrated violence of men learning their deadly trade. The exercises are deceptively simple. Strike the post with your sword, aiming for specific targets that Doctor calls out. The head a killing blow that must be precise and powerful. The neck a cut that requires perfect angle and timing. The torso seeking the gaps between ribs where a blade might slip through to find vital organs. Each strike must be followed immediately by a defensive movement, a shield coming up to block an imaginary counterattack. At first, the movements feel awkward and unnatural. Your sword arm grows heavy within minutes. Your shield arm begins to ache and tremble. The leather grip becomes slippery with sweat, and you find yourself constantly adjusting your stance, seeking some position that doesn't feel precarious and exposed. Around you, the other trainees are going through similar struggles, some further along in their development, others even newer and more awkward than yourself. The hours pass in this rhythm of strike and block, punctuated by Doctor's corrections and encouragements. Your feet are barbarian, they're not roots, they must move. Shield higher Syria in your throat is a gift to your opponent. Breathe, boy, dead men fight poorly. As the morning progresses, the courtyard fills with the sounds of training. The solid thunk of wooden swords against straw-wrapped posts, the slap of sandaled feet against sand, the labored breathing of men pushing their bodies beyond comfortable limits. The sun climbs higher, and the heat begins to build. Sweat runs down your face, stinging your eyes and dripping onto the sand below. Your tunic clings to your body, darkened with moisture and streaked with dust. The physical demands of the training are matched by the mental challenges. Every movement must be precise, purposeful, economical. There's no room for wasted motion or dramatic flourishes. In the arena, Doctor reminds you constantly, spectacle is important, but survival is paramount. The crowd wants to see skill and courage, not clumsy bravado that leads to quick death. Watch the gladiators who live longest, he tells you during a brief rest period, as you lean against the wall in the shade, chest heaving. They're not the ones who take unnecessary risks or fight with reckless abandon. They're the ones who learn to read their opponents, who understand when to attack and when to wait, who know that sometimes the most courageous thing is to give ground and look for a better opportunity. As the training session continues, you begin to understand that what you're relearning isn't just swordplay, it is a complete philosophy of combat, a way of thinking about violence that's both practical and deeply psychological. You're learning to suppress natural human reactions, the instinct to flinch, to close your eyes, to turn away from danger. Instead, you're developing new instincts, artificial but potentially life-saving responses that must become as automatic as breathing. The afternoon brings different challenges. If the morning was about building strength and basic technique, the afternoon is about application and adaptation. You're paired with other trainees for controlled sparring, using wooden swords and heavily padded armor. The goal isn't to injure injured gladiators who can't train or fight, but to test your developing skills against a thinking, reacting opponent. Your first sparring partner is the young Gaul you noticed in the dormitory. Up close, you can see that his smooth face is deceptive. There's intelligence in his eyes and a quickness to his movements that suggests natural athleticism. As you face each other across the sand, wooden swords raised, you realize that this moment represents a fundamental shift in your training. No longer are you striking at passive targets. Now you must deal with an opponent who wants to strike back. The bout begins cautiously, both of you testing the other's defenses with careful, probing attacks. Your sword meets his shield with a dull thud, and his counterattack skims past your ear close enough that you can feel the displacement of air. Gradually, as confidence builds, the pace increases. You find yourself moving in ways that feel both foreign and strangely natural, your body beginning to integrate the lessons of the morning's training. When his blade finally slips past your guard and taps you firmly on the ribs, you experience a moment of profound realization. In a real fight, with real weapons, you would now be dying. The knowledge sits in your stomach like a cold stone, but it's also strangely motivating. You redouble your efforts, and when you finally manage to land a clean strike on his shoulder, the satisfaction is unlike anything you've ever felt. The sparring continues throughout the afternoon, each bout teaching new lessons about distance, timing, and the deadly geometry of combat. You begin to understand that fighting isn't just about strength or speed, it is about reading your opponent's intentions, about creating and exploiting tiny windows of opportunity, about maintaining perfect balance between aggression and caution. As the sun begins to sink toward the horizon, casting long shadows across the training ground, Doctor calls an end to the day's formal training. But the learning doesn't stop. In the evening hours, the more experienced gladiators often gather in small groups to discuss. Techniques share stories from their own arena experiences, or simply to maintain the bonds of brotherhood that might be the only thing standing between them and complete despair. You find yourself drawn into one of these informal gatherings, sitting in a circle on the cool stone of the covered walkway. An older gladiator, a Thracian whose scarred face speaks of many battles survived, talks quietly about the importance of understanding your opponent's fighting style before the bout begins. In the arena, he says, his voice barely above a whisper, you have perhaps 30 seconds to read your opponent, to understand whether he's aggressive or defensive, whether he favors his left side or his right, whether he's experienced or green. Those 30 seconds can mean the difference between walking out alive or being dragged out by your heels. Another gladiator, a former criminal whose quick smile seems at odds with the violence of his chosen profession, adds his own wisdom. The crowd will try to influence you. They'll shout for blood, for spectacular moves, for foolish bravery. But remember, they go home to their families every night. You must fight for yourself, not for their entertainment. These conversations continue deep into the evening, punctuated by the simple evening meal and the gradual settling of the ludus into the quiet rhythms of night. As you finally return to your straw mattress, your body aching from the day's exertions, you realize that something fundamental has changed within you. The soft civilian you were this morning is already becoming someone else, someone harder, more focused, more aware of the constant presence of mortality. You lie in the darkness, listening to the breathing of the men around you, and understand that tomorrow will bring the same routine. The harsh awakening, the silent breakfast, the hours of brutal training, the gradual transformation of your body and mind into something Rome can use. The rhythm of this existence is becoming familiar, almost comforting in its predictability. Yet beneath the surface of routine, you sense the deeper currents that flow through the ludus, the unspoken knowledge that all this training is preparation for moments of ultimate truth, when the wooden swords will be replaced by steel, and the protective armor removed to reveal vulnerable flesh. The men sleeping around you are all traveling toward the same destination, though some may arrive sooner than others. As sleep finally takes you, your last conscious thought is of the sand in the training yard, and how it will feel different. Tomorrow more familiar, more like home, but also more ominous, as if it's already measuring you for the space you might one day occupy permanently. The smell of iron and sweat has become the scent of your new life, and in your dreams, you can already hear the distant roar of crowds hauling for blood. But not every gladiator accepted this rhythm of controlled violence and delayed death. In the spring of 73 BCE, in a ludus very much like the one you've just experienced, a moment of defiance would echo through history like thunder across the Mediterranean world. Let your mind drift now from the familiar routine of training to that particular day when everything changed, when the careful order of the gladiator schools shattered like pottery dropped on stone. Picture yourself now in Capua, the jewel of Campania, where the morning air carries the scent of olive groves and the distant sea. The ludus of Lentulus Batiatus sits on a hill overlooking the city, its walls higher and more imposing than most, for it houses some of Rome's most valuable and dangerous human property. This is where the best gladiators train, where the crowds expect to see the most skilled fighters, and where the investment in human flesh runs deepest. The man they call Spartacus moves through his morning routine with the same disciplined precision you've learned to recognize in experienced gladiators. But if you could see behind his eyes, those dark, calculating eyes that have seen too much, you would understand that he is not preparing for another day of training. He's preparing for war. Spartacus is not a young man. Perhaps 35 years have marked his face and body, though the exact count matters less than the weight of experience they carry. He was born in Thrace, that wild land beyond the Danube, where Rome's influence grows thin, and the old gods still demand blood sacrifices. As a young man, he served as an auxiliary in the Roman legions, learning their tactics, their discipline, their strengths and weaknesses from the inside. When circumstances, perhaps desertion, perhaps some act of defiance against Roman authority, led to his enslavement and eventual sale to the ludus, he brought with him something more dangerous than mere fighting skill. He brought knowledge of how Rome's military machine actually worked. In the months leading up to this spring morning, Spartacus has been watching, learning, planning. He's observed the routines of the guards, noting when they're most alert and when familiarity breeds carelessness. He studied the layout of the ludus, memorizing every door, every passage, every potential weapon. Most importantly, he's been talking to his fellow gladiators, not the casual conversations of the evening gatherings, but careful whispered discussions about freedom, about dignity, about the possibility that death might be preferable to this endless cycle of training for the entertainment of others. The morning begins like any other, with the sharp crack of the dormitory master's staff against iron bars. But as you watch Spartacus rise from his straw mattress, you can sense something different in his movements, a coiled tension, like a spring compressed to its limit. Around him, perhaps 70 other gladiators go through their morning rituals, unaware that this day will mark a dividing line in their lives, before Spartacus and after. The breakfast in the refectory carries an undercurrent of electricity that most don't recognize. Spartacus sits with his closest allies, Crixus, a massive Gaul, whose scarred hands speak of countless battles. Enemos, a Germanic warrior whose blonde hair has been cropped in the Roman style, but whose blue eyes still burn with northern fire. and perhaps 20 others who have been carefully recruited over the weeks and months of planning. They eat their barley porridge and drink their watered wine, but their attention is focused on details, invisible to the casual observer. The placement of the guards, the timing of the kitchen slaves, the location of anything that might serve as a weapon. The key to understanding what happens next lies in appreciating how thoroughly the Romans had systematized the business of gladiatorial combat. Every aspect of the ludus was designed for control from the high walls that prevented escape to the careful rationing of metal implements that might be turned into weapons. Even the training weapons, those wooden swords and blunted spears, were counted and collected after each session. The Romans understood that they were keeping human lions in cages, and they'd learned to be careful about what they left within reach of the claws. But on this particular morning, the system encounters something it was undesigned to handle: desperation combined with military intelligence and leadership ability. As the gladiators file out for their morning training, Spartacus and his conspirators put their plan into motion with the precision of a military operation. The first step is deceptively simple. During the transition from breakfast to training, when the normal flow of movement provides cover, several of the conspirators slip away from the main group. They've spent weeks studying the kitchen routines, and they know that at this precise moment, the cooking slaves are busy preparing the midday meal, leaving the kitchen temporarily unguarded. More importantly, they know that the kitchen contains not just food, but knives, iron blades meant for cutting meat and vegetables, but equally capable of cutting human flesh. Imagine yourself following them through the narrow corridors of the ludus as they move with the silent efficiency of hunters. The kitchen, when they reach it, is exactly as they expected, empty of people, but rich with possibilities. The knives are there, dozens of them, ranging from small paring blades to heavy cleavers designed for butchering. But the conspirators take more than just knives. They gather iron spits used for roasting meat, heavy enough to serve as clubs or spears. They take the long iron forks used for handling food over fires. They even gather the heavier ceramic vessels that could serve as improvised missiles. While this first group arms itself, Spartacus and the others begin the more dangerous part of the plan, the actual uprising. The moment of truth comes during the morning training session, when the gladiators are spread across the courtyard and the guards are in their usual positions. Spartacus has chosen this timing carefully. The guards are alert, but not alarmed, positioned to prevent escape attempts, but not expecting coordinated violence from within the compound. The signal is subtle. Spartacus simply drops his wooden practice sword and looks toward the covered walkway, where the first group of conspirators should be emerging with their improvised weapons. For a moment that stretches like eternity, nothing happens. Then, like a wave breaking against shore, violence erupts across the training ground. The first guard to die probably never understands what's happening. One moment he's watching routine training exercises. The next, a gladiator he's seen every day for months is upon him with a kitchen knife, moving with the deadly precision that months of combat training have ingrained in every muscle. The guard's cry of alarm dies in his throat, literally cut short, and his sword, his real iron sword, passes into gladiator hands. What follows is not a battle in any conventional sense, but rather a rapidly expanding contagion of violence. Each guard who falls provides weapons for more gladiators. Each successful attack emboldens others who might have hesitated. Within minutes, the careful order of the ludus dissolves into chaos, as men who have spent months learning to kill suddenly find themselves with both the means and the motivation to practice their deadly skills on their captors. The guards, despite their training and equipment, find themselves at a fatal disadvantage. They're fighting men who have nothing left to lose, men who would rather die fighting than continue living as property. More importantly, they're fighting men who have been specifically trained in combat, who understand weapons and tactics in ways that ordinary soldiers might not. The irony is bitter and perfect. Rome's own gladiatorial system has created the instruments of its destruction. Spartacus moves through the fighting like a force of nature, his military experience evident in every decision. While others are caught up in the immediate violence, he's thinking strategically, understanding that killing a few guards is meaningless unless they can break free from the ludus entirely. He directs some of his followers to secure the gates, others to gather weapons and supplies, still others to spread the word to gladiators who might still be hesitating. The breaking point comes when they reach the armory, the locked chamber where the real weapons are stored, the swords and shields and armor that gladiators use in actual combat. The Romans had secured this room with heavy locks and thick doors, but they hadn't considered that desperate men with iron tools and nothing to lose might be willing to spend precious time breaking through such barriers. When the armory door finally gives way, splintering under repeated attacks from iron spits and stolen swords, the balance of power shifts decisively. Now they have not just kitchen knives and improvised weapons, but actual gladi, the short, deadly swords that Roman soldiers carry into battle. They have shields, helmets, armor. Most importantly, they have hope. What began as a desperate revolt is transforming into something that might actually succeed. But Spartacus understands that success means more than just breaking out of the ludus. It means staying free, and that requires thinking beyond the immediate moment of escape. As his followers arm themselves with proper weapons, he's already planning the next phases of what he knows must become a running campaign. They'll need food, shelter, defensible positions. They'll need to move quickly before Roman forces can organize a response. Most critically, they'll need to grow their numbers, because no matter how skilled they are as fighters, 70 men cannot stand against the might of Rome indefinitely. The actual escape from the ludus, when it comes, is almost anticlimactic. The gates that seemed so imposing when viewed from within proved to be merely barriers, designed to keep in men who accepted their captivity. When confronted with gladiators who have rejected that acceptance, who are willing to die rather than remain slaves, the gates become just another obstacle to be overcome through violence and determination. As the sun reaches its zenith on that spring day in 73 BCE, Spartacus leads his followers out through the shattered gates of the ludus and onto the roads of Campania. Behind them, the training ground where they spent so many hours preparing for staged combat lies stained with real blood. Ahead of them stretches the unknown territory of freedom, dangerous and uncertain, but infinitely preferable to the predictable horror of their former existence. The group that emerges from the ludus is no longer just a collection of gladiators. Under Spartacus's leadership, they've become something new, a military unit with a purpose beyond entertainment. They move with the discipline of soldiers. Their newly acquired weapons carried with the confidence of men who have already proven their willingness to use them. The training that was meant to make them valuable property has instead made them into something Rome never intended: an organized force capable of challenging Roman authority itself. As they disappear into the countryside around Capua, spreading out along different routes to make pursuit more difficult, each man carries with him the memory of that moment when everything changed. They remember the look in Spartacus' eyes when he dropped his wooden sword and chose freedom over security. They remember the feeling of real steel in their hands after months of fighting with practice weapons. Most importantly, they remember the taste of hope, bitter and dangerous, but more nourishing than any meal they'd ever eaten in captivity. The news of the escape spreads through Capua like wildfire, carried by terrified guards, traumatized slaves, and gleeful rumors. In the forums and markets, citizens gather to discuss this unprecedented event. Some are simply shocked that such a thing could happen. The gladiatorial system seems so secure, so perfectly designed to contain its human animals. Others are more thoughtful, understanding instinctively that this escape represents something larger and more dangerous than a simple prison break. In Rome itself, when the news finally arrives, the reaction is mixed. Some senators dismiss it as a minor disturbance that will be quickly suppressed by local authorities. After all, how long can a handful of runaway gladiators survive in the countryside? They have no base of support, no supplies, no strategic objective beyond avoiding recapture. Surely they'll be hunted down within days, weeks at most. But others, particularly those with military experience, recognize the potential danger. Spartacus is not just any escaped slave. He's a former soldier who understands Roman tactics and Roman weaknesses. His followers are not ordinary runaways, but trained fighters who have proven their willingness to kill Roman citizens. Most ominously, they've chosen to stay together rather than scatter, suggesting that they have some larger plan than simply seeking individual freedom. As night falls on that day of escape, Spartacus and his followers make camp in the hills above Capua. They post sentries with the professional competence of soldiers, distribute their stolen food with the careful rationing of men who understand that they may not eat regularly for some time, and tend their wounded with the practical efficiency of people who have grown accustomed to violence. But as they sit around their small fires, sharing the last of the wine they liberated from the ludus, they're no longer just escaped slaves. They've become something that Rome has never faced before. Gladiators, who have chosen to turn their deadly skills against the system that created them. The training ground that was meant to prepare them for death in the arena has instead prepared them for war against Rome itself. The revolt that began with a dropped wooden sword will grow into something that shakes the foundations of the Republic. It will attract thousands of followers, win stunning victories against professional Roman armies, and create a legend that will survive long after the last of the rebels has fallen. But all of that lies in the future. Tonight, in the hills above Capua, there are simply 70 men who have chosen freedom over safety, uncertainty over the predictable horror of their former lives. As you watch them settling into sleep around their guttering fires, weapons close at hand and freedom like wine in their veins, you understand that you've witnessed one of history's great moments of transformation. A single act of defiance has set in motion events that will echo through the centuries, inspiring slaves and rebels and freedom fighters in ages yet to come. The gladiator who dropped his wooden sword and picked up a kitchen knife has become something larger than himself. He's become the embodiment of the human refusal to accept bondage, no matter how gilded the chains might be. But let us return now from the hills of rebellion to the more controlled violence of the arena itself, to examine the instruments that made gladiatorial combat both spectacle and science. For while Spartacus and his followers carried stolen kitchen knives into their bid for freedom, the gladiators who remained within the system wielded weapons that were marvels of engineering, designed with the same precision and purpose that Romans brought to their roads, their aqueducts, and their conquests. Imagine yourself descending into the depths beneath the Colosseum, into the hypogeum, that vast underground complex of chambers, corridors, and mechanical systems that made the arena's spectacles possible. Here, in rooms lit by oil lamps that cast dancing shadows on stone walls, craftsmen practiced an art form as old as warfare itself, the creation of instruments designed to take human life with maximum efficiency and dramatic effect. The armamentarium, the weapons room, occupies several interconnected chambers, each one dedicated to a different aspect of gladiatorial armament. The air here carries the sharp scent of iron and oil, mixed with the leather smell of well-maintained armor and the subtle acrid odor of the whetstones used to maintain cutting edges. This is where death is refined into its most elegant forms, where the crude business of killing is elevated into something approaching artistry. Consider first the gladius itself, the short sword that gave its name to the gladiators who wielded it. In your hands, it feels surprisingly heavy for its size, the weight distributed in a way that makes it seem to seek its own balance point. The blade is perhaps 18 inches long, double-edged, with a pronounced central ridge that runs from hilt to point. This ridge serves multiple purposes. It strengthens the blade against side-to-side stress, creates channels that allow blood to flow away from the cutting edges, and provides the perfect geometry for both slashing and thrusting attacks. The gladius you're holding was forged in the workshops near Rome, where smiths who learned their trade, making weapons for the legions, applied their skills to creating instruments for the arena. The steel is harder than that used in ordinary swords. Repeatedly heated and cooled in a process, it creates a blade capable of holding an edge sharp enough to slice through leather, flesh, and bone with equal ease. Yet it's also flexible enough to bend without breaking when subjected to the lateral stresses of combat. The hilt fits your hand with uncomfortable perfection, its grip wrapped in leather that has been treated with oils to prevent slipping, even when wet with sweat or blood. The pommel, the weighted end of the handle, serves as both counterbalance and weapon, heavy enough to crush bone if brought down on an opponent's skull. Every aspect of the weapon's design reflects generations of refinement, each modification purchased with the lives of men who discovered its predecessor as weaknesses in the most final way possible. But the gladius, for all its perfection, represents just one approach to arena combat. Move with me to another section of the armamentarium, where the tridents of the retiari await their wielders. These three-pronged spears seem almost agricultural in their simplicity, reminiscent of the fishing spears used by Mediterranean fishermen to capture large prey. Yet in the arena, they become instruments of a uniquely Roman form of combat theater. The trident you lift is nearly 7 feet long, its wooden shaft seasoned oak that has been treated with resins to make it both flexible and durable. The three-pronged head is wrought iron, each tine sharp enough to punch through muscle and long enough to reach vital organs, even through the protective equipment of an opponent. But the trident's true genius lies not in its ability to kill quickly, but in its capacity to control and immobilize. The Retiarius, the net fighter who wielded this weapon, fought according to a philosophy completely different from that of the gladius-armed secutor or murmillo, where those gladiators sought to close distance and finish their opponents with quick, decisive strikes. The Retiarius used his trident to maintain distance, to probe for weaknesses, to gradually wear down his opponent through a series of smaller wounds and defensive maneuvers. Watch as an experienced Retiarius demonstrates the weapon's use, moving through the training forms with fluid grace. The trident becomes an extension of his arms, jabbing forward to threaten or actually wound, then withdrawing before a counterattack can develop. The three-pronged head allows him to catch his opponent's sword between the tines, potentially disarming him, or at least controlling his weapon long enough to create an opening for attack. But the trident was never used alone. Beside it, hanging from specially designed brackets, are the nets that gave the Retiarius his name. These are not fishing nets scaled up for human combat, but precisely engineered tools designed specifically for entangling armed opponents. The net you examine weighs perhaps 10 pounds, its lead weights distributed around the perimeter with mathematical precision. When thrown correctly, it opens into a perfect circle, spreading to cover the maximum possible area while maintaining enough weight to carry it forward despite air resistance. The net's construction reveals the same attention to detail that characterizes all Roman engineering. The mesh is made from rope that has been treated with oils to make it both flexible and resistant to cutting. The knots are tied in a specific pattern that distributes stress evenly throughout the structure, preventing any single strand from bearing too much load. Most cleverly, the lead weights are attached in such a way that they help the net wrap around its target, using momentum and gravity to create a cocoon of rope that becomes more constraining the more the victim struggles. In combination, the trident and net created a fighting style that was as much about psychology as physical combat. The Retiarius fought almost naked, wearing only a loincloth and a distinctive manica armor sleeve that protected his sword arm. This apparent vulnerability was deceptive, for his real protection lay in mobility and the ability to control the distance and timing of combat. Move now to a different section of the armamentarium, where the weapons of the heavily armored gladiators await. Here you'll find the curved swords of the Thracians, weapons that seem to embody the wild, mountainous land of their origin. The Thracian Sika is perhaps 2 feet long, its blade curving forward like a frozen wave. This shape, which might seem purely decorative, actually serves specific tactical purposes. The curve allows the Sika to strike around an opponent's shield, following the natural motion of a sweeping cut to find flesh that would be protected against a straight thrust. More subtly, the curve changes the weapon's balance point, making it faster in the hand despite its substantial weight. When wielded by a skilled Thracian gladiator, the Sika becomes a blur of curved steel, following unpredictable angles of attack that confuse opponents trained to deal with straight-bladed weapons. The Thracians' equipment represents a different philosophy of arena combat, one based on mobility and the ability to deliver powerful strikes from unexpected angles. His shield de Parma is smaller than those carried by other gladiator types, barely large enough to protect his torso. This apparent disadvantage is compensated by his leg armor elaborate, greaves that protect his shins and knees while allowing the freedom of movement necessary for his aggressive fighting style. But perhaps the most psychologically effective weapons in the arena belong to the gladiators, known as scissors, literally cutters. Their primary weapon was a device that modern observers might mistake for a torture instrument, a tube of steel that enclosed the gladiator's entire forearm, ending in a curved blade that projected forward like a metallic extension of the arm itself. The scissor weapon you examine seems almost alien in its design, more like a piece of industrial machinery than a traditional weapon. The tube that encases the forearm is lined with leather padding, making it comfortable to wear for extended periods. The blade itself is perhaps 18 inches long, curved like a scythe and sharp enough to slice through rope, leather, or flesh with equal ease. What makes this weapon truly terrifying is the way it transforms the gladiator's arm into a cutting tool, eliminating the distinction between weapon and wielder. Fighting with the scissor required completely relearning the basics of combat. Traditional swordplay relies on the weapon being separate from the body, allowing for complex manipulations of blade angle and position. The scissor gladiator sacrificed this flexibility in exchange for the ability to deliver cuts of tremendous power, using the full strength of his arm and shoulder to drive the blade through his opponent's defenses. The psychological effect of facing a scissor gladiator must have been profound. Opponents found themselves confronting not just a man with a weapon, but something that seemed to be part man, part cutting machine. The scissor's reach was deceptive. What looked like a grappling distance was actually within the weapon's effective range, allowing the scissor gladiator to deliver devastating cuts when his opponent thought he was safe. Each of these weapon types required not just different fighting techniques, but different approaches to training, different physical conditioning, even different mental preparation. The Retiarius needed the flexibility and endurance of a dancer, combined with the timing and accuracy of a hunter. The Thracian required explosive power and the ability to generate tremendous cutting force, despite his weapon as curved geometry. The scissor gladiator had to learn to fight with a weapon that fundamentally altered his body mechanics, forcing him to develop entirely new patterns of movement and attack. But weapons alone did not make gladiators. In another section of the underground complex, you discover the workshops where the protective equipment was manufactured and maintained. Here, craftsmen who might otherwise have spent their lives making armor for legionnaires instead devoted their skills to creating the elaborate protective gear that kept gladiators alive long enough to provide entertainment. The helmet of a Murmillo gladiator represents the pinnacle of this protective artistry. Wrought from bronze and steel, it encloses the wearer's entire head while still allowing adequate vision and breathing. The face mask is particularly ingenious, with eye holes positioned to provide maximum peripheral vision while protecting the eyes themselves from direct attack. The breathing holes are placed to allow adequate airflow without creating weak points that an opponent might exploit. The helmet's decoration serves purposes beyond mere aesthetics. The elaborate crests and plumes that adorn many gladiatorial helmets help spectators distinguish between different fighters, while also providing psychological advantages to their wearers. A gladiator crowned with an impressive helmet crest carries himself differently than one who fights bareheaded, and this psychological effect can translate into real combat advantages. The body armor worn by different gladiator types reflects the same careful balance between protection and mobility that characterizes all arena equipment. The manica worn by retiari protects the sword arm while leaving the rest of the body free to move. The greaves worn by Thracians guard the legs while allowing the quick footwork that their fighting style demands. Even the heavy armor worn by secutors is designed to allow the specific types of movement that their tactics require. As you examine these instruments of controlled violence, you begin to understand that gladiatorial combat was never simply about putting armed men in an arena and letting them fight. It was a carefully choreographed form of entertainment that required precise matching of opponents, specialized equipment, and fighters trained in complementary styles. The weapons and armor were designed not just to facilitate combat, but to create specific types of combat that would provide maximum spectacle for the crowds. The net and trident versus sword and shield. A curved blade and small shield versus the straight sword and large shield. The armored secutor pursuing the nearly naked retiarius around the arena. Each matchup was designed to create drama, to provide moments of apparent advantage that could shift quickly to desperate disadvantage, to keep the crowd engaged and emotionally invested in the outcome. But behind all this careful engineering and tactical consideration lay a simple, brutal truth. These weapons were designed to kill human beings, and they performed that function with terrible efficiency. The men who wielded them might be called gladiators, might be celebrated as heroes or artists, but in the end, they were slaves whose primary purpose was to die in entertaining ways for the amusement of free Roman citizens. As you ascend from the hypogeum back toward the arena floor, carrying with you the weight of knowledge about these instruments of death, you understand that you've explored not just weapons, but the entire philosophy of a civilization that could transform murder into entertainment, that could elevate killing to the level of high art. The weapons of the arena were masterpieces of engineering, but they were masterpieces designed for the darkest of purposes. The sand of the arena floor, when you finally emerge into daylight, takes on new meaning. You understand now that it was chosen not just for its ability to provide secure footing, but for its capacity to absorb blood without becoming muddy, to maintain its pale color even after repeated soaking with the life force of the men who fought and died upon it. Even something as simple as sand becomes part of the machinery of death when viewed through the lens of Roman efficiency. Yet from this world of controlled violence and engineered death, something unexpected could emerge. Fame, adoration, and paradoxically, a kind of twisted freedom that came with celebrity. Let your mind drift now from the underground armory to a very different setting, the marble halls of the imperial palace, where the scent of exotic spices mingles with the soft murmur of cultured conversation, and where gladiators might find themselves, not as entertainers dying for amusement, but as honored guests reclining on silk cushions beside the most powerful people in the world. Picture yourself in the triclinium of Emperor Commodus in the year 190 CE. When the empire has reached the height of its territorial expansion and the excesses of imperial court, life have evolved into something that would have shocked even Augustus. The dining hall stretches before you like a vision from a fevered dream walls of polished marble from distant quarries. Floors inlaid with precious stones, arranged in patterns that tell stories of conquest and glory, and ceiling frescoes that depict gods and heroes and scenes of eternal triumph. The evening air drifts through tall windows that overlook the imperial gardens, carrying the fragrance of roses and jasmine, the splash of fountains, and the distant sound of musicians practicing their art. Oil lamps burn in elaborate bronze fixtures, their flames steady and smokeless, filling the room with a warm, golden light that makes everything seem touched by the hand of Midas himself. This is luxury refined to its essence, wealth so concentrated that it becomes almost abstract, like a mathematical concept made manifest in marble and gold. At the center of this opulent stage reclines the emperor himself, and if you could see him clearly, you would understand immediately why the Senate whispers and the Praetorian Guard exchanges worried glances. Commodus is no longer the young man who inherited the throne from Marcus Aurelius. The years of absolute power have carved themselves into his features, creating a face that might once have been handsome, but now bears the marks of appetites that have grown beyond all human scale. He wears a tunic of silk so fine it seems to flow like liquid, dyed in purple so deep it appears almost black in the lamplight. Around his neck hangs a chain of gold links, each one larger than a man's thumb, and on his fingers rings that contain gemstones worth more than most citizens will see in their lifetimes. But it's his eyes that reveal the true nature of the man. They hold the particular brightness of someone who has discovered that there are no limits to what he can do, no boundaries that cannot be crossed, no desires that cannot be satisfied. Tonight Commodus has arranged something that even by imperial standards qualifies as extraordinary. A dinner party where gladiators sit as equals, beside senators, where men who normally face death for entertainment instead find themselves entertained by the most powerful people in the world. It's a tableau that perfectly captures the strange contradictions of Roman society, where slaves could become celebrities, where men sentenced to die could achieve a kind of immortality, and where the emperor himself could choose to blur the lines between ruler and entertainer. Reclining on the couch to Commodus's right is Narcissus, perhaps the most famous gladiator of his generation. If you could study his face in the lamplight, you would see features that might have been carved by a sculptor: the strong jaw, the aquiline nose, the dark eyes that have learned to read death in an opponent's movements. His body bears the accumulated scars of a dozen arena victories, the white line across his left shoulder where a Thracian's curved sword found its mark, the puckered scar on his forearm where a trident punctured muscle, the careful way he holds his right side where broken ribs never quite healed properly. Yet despite these marks of violence, Narcissus moves with the fluid grace of a natural athlete, and when he speaks, his voice carries the quiet confidence of a man who has faced the ultimate test repeatedly and survived. Tonight, he wears a toga of finest wool, a garment that transforms him from gladiator to gentleman, though the transformation is never quite complete. Even in silk and luxury, he remains fundamentally different from the other dinner guests. There's a watchfulness in his eyes, a tension in his posture that speaks of reflexes honed for survival. The conversation at the emperor's table flows like wine, touching on topics that range from philosophy to gossip to the peculiar logistics of staging spectacular entertainments. Commodus, who fancies himself something of an intellectual, holds forth on the nature of courage, asking whether true bravery lies in facing a known enemy or in confronting the unknown. The senators nod and murmur agreement, offering their own carefully measured thoughts on the subject. But when the emperor turns to Narcissus and asks for his opinion, the gladiator's response cuts through the philosophical abstractions like a blade through silk. "Caesar," he says, his voice carrying just enough deference to avoid offense, "have found that courage is not something you possess or lack, but something you choose moment by moment, when fear tells you to run and honor tells you to stand." The table falls silent for a moment, not because the words are profound, but because they carry the weight of lived experience. These are not the thoughts of a man who has read about courage in scrolls, but of someone who has felt his bowels turn to water at the sight of an opponent's blade and chosen to advance anyway. The senators shift uncomfortably, suddenly aware that they are in the presence of someone who has tested philosophical concepts in the most literal way possible. As the evening progresses and the wine flows more freely, the conversation turns to the gladiators' recent victories. Commodus, his eyes bright with excitement, asks for details about Narcissus' latest bout, spectacular encounter with a Germanic warrior whose size and strength had made him a crowd favorite until Narcissus' superior technique and experience prevailed. The gladiator obliges, describing the fight with the matter-of-fact precision of a craftsman discussing his work. He was strong, Caesar, perhaps the strongest man I have ever faced. When our shields met, I felt the impact in my bones. But strength without wisdom is like a sword without a hilt, dangerous to everyone, including the one who wields it. As Narcissus speaks, you can see him remembering the fight, his hands unconsciously moving, as if still holding weapons, his eyes focusing on some distant point where death had waited with patient indifference. He fought with the fury of his people, all wild charges and crushing blows. But fury burns out quickly, like a torch in the wind. I gave ground, let him exhaust himself against my defense, waited for the moment when strength would become weakness. When it came, Narcissus pauses, seeming to consider how much detail is appropriate for such refined company. When it came, it was over quickly. The emperor leans forward, fascinated by this glimpse into a world he can observe but never truly enter. Despite his wealth and power, despite his ability to command the death of any person in the empire, Commodus has never faced the kind of personal, immediate danger that defines a gladiator's existence. There's something in his expression that might be envy, though he would never acknowledge such a thing even to himself. "Tell me," Commodus says, his voice dropping to a more intimate register, "what is it like? That moment when you know that one of you must die, when all the training and preparation comes down to a few heartbeats of pure action." Narcissus considers the question carefully, understanding that his answer will reveal something fundamental about himself to the most powerful man in the world. "It is like being completely awake for the first time in your life, Caesar. Everything becomes clear: your opponent's intentions, your own capabilities, the precise location of every muscle in your body. Time moves differently. A heartbeat becomes long enough to see death approaching and decide whether to meet it or turn it aside." He pauses, then adds quietly, "It is terrible and beautiful at the same time, like watching lightning strike. And afterward, if you survive, everything else seems muted by comparison. Food tastes less vivid, colors appear dull. Even the most intense pleasures feel somehow distant." The honesty of this response seems to affect everyone at the table differently. The senators look uncomfortable, perhaps recognizing that they have never experienced anything approaching such intensity in their own carefully protected lives. The emperor's expression is harder to read, but there's something hungry in his eyes, as if Narcissus has described a meal he desperately wants to taste. As the dinner continues, other gladiators arrive, not as entertainment or spectacle, but as guests in their own right. There's Flamma, a Syrian whose record of victories has made him wealthy enough to buy his own freedom, but who continues to fight from choice rather than compulsion. His presence adds another layer to the evening's complexity, for here is a man who has transcended the basic categories of Roman society, who is neither slave nor citizen, but something new entirely. Flamma moves through the gathering with the easy confidence of someone who has found his place in the world through his own efforts. His conversation reveals an intelligence sharpened by constant proximity to death, and his observations about Roman society carry the weight of someone who has seen it from multiple perspectives. When he speaks about the crowd's reactions to different types of combat, his analysis is more sophisticated than anything the senators might offer, informed by direct experience of how human nature reveals itself when death hangs in the balance. The food served at this extraordinary dinner represents the pinnacle of Roman culinary art. Course after course arrives from the imperial kitchens: delicate fish prepared with spices from India, fowl stuffed with exotic fruits from Africa, vegetables that have been bred for size and flavor on estates across the empire. The wine flows from amphora that bear the seals of vineyards whose names are synonymous with excellence. Yet as you watch the gladiators navigate this feast, you notice the subtle ways their origins continue to shape their behavior. They eat with genuine appreciation, but also with the unconscious efficiency of men who have learned never to waste food. They sample the exotic delicacies with curiosity, but their real enthusiasm is reserved for the simple bread and meat that forms the foundation of the meal. Most tellingly, they remain alert even in this safe environment, their eyes continuing to scan the room, their posture never completely relaxed. The conversation eventually turns to the gladiators' lives outside the arena, and here the true strangeness of their situation becomes apparent. Narcissus describes his villa on the Bay of Naples, purchased with the winnings from his victories, where he keeps a staff of servants and receives visits from admirers who travel from across the empire to meet him. He speaks of marriage offers from wealthy women who are fascinated by his dangerous profession, of business opportunities that arise from his fame, of the peculiar social position he occupies as someone who is simultaneously celebrated and despised. "I am invited to dinners like this one," he explains, gesturing around the opulent room, "where I sit beside men who control the fate of provinces. Yet I am also barred from the public baths in certain neighborhoods, where my presence would be considered contaminating. I am famous throughout the empire, but I cannot hold public office or marry into the nobility. I am both more and less than a citizen, a creature of contradictions that only Rome could create." This paradox seems to delight Commodus, who sees in it a reflection of his own complex relationship with Roman society. As emperor, he stands above all traditional categories, able to reshape the rules that govern everyone else's lives. The presence of these gladiators at his table represents a kind of imperial prerogative, a demonstration that he can elevate or debase anyone according to his whims. But as the evening wears on and the wine continues to flow, you begin to sense undercurrents that complicate this seemingly straightforward display of imperial power. The gladiators, despite their courtesy and apparent gratitude, retain a fundamental independence that cannot be bought or commanded. They have faced death repeatedly and survived, and this experience has given them a kind of immunity to the normal pressures of Roman social hierarchy. When a senator makes a casual comment about the expandability of slaves, Flamma's response is polite but pointed. "Perhaps, my lord, but slaves who can kill are more valuable than those who cannot." The comment hangs in the air for a moment, neither quite a threat nor entirely a jest, but something that reminds everyone present that these men are dangerous in ways that go beyond their entertainment value. The emperor seems to relish these moments of tension, these reminders that he is dining with men who could theoretically harm him if they chose to do so. It adds spice to the evening, a free song of danger that makes the luxury more intense by contrast. Yet you also sense that Commodus understands the implicit bargain that makes such evenings possible. The gladiators receive honor, wealth, and access to the highest levels of society, while the emperor gains the reflected glory of associating with men whose courage and skill have been proven in the most public possible way. As the night deepens and the conversation becomes more intimate, you hear stories that reveal the true complexity of gladiatorial life. Narcissus speaks of his relationship with a woman who was once a senator's wife, whose fascination with his dangerous profession led her to leave her comfortable marriage for the uncertain excitement of loving a man who might die at any moment. The relationship, he explains, is both passionate and troubled, colored by her romanticized vision of his life and his realistic understanding of its likely duration. Flamma describes the strange brotherhood that exists among successful gladiators, men who are simultaneously colleagues and potential opponents, who train together knowing that they might one day face each other in mortal combat. "We share something that no one else can understand," he says, his voice thoughtful. "We have looked into the face of death together, and that creates bonds that are stronger than blood, yet more fragile than morning mist." These stories paint a picture of lives lived at the intersection of fame and mortality, where every victory brings both reward and the increased likelihood of eventual defeat. The gladiators speak of planning for retirement, even as they acknowledge that few in their profession live long enough to enjoy it. They describe the peculiar psychology required to perform at the highest level, while remaining aware that each performance might be their last. As the evening draws toward its close, Commodus raises a final toast to his extraordinary guests. To courage, he says, his voice carrying a note of genuine respect, and to those who transform death into art. The gladiators drink deeply, understanding that they are being honored not just for their skills, but for their willingness to risk everything for the entertainment of others. Yet as you watch them prepare to leave this marble paradise and return to their uncertain lives, you understand that the evening has been as much about the emperor's needs as their elevation. Commodus has surrounded himself with men whose courage and authenticity make his own existence seem more meaningful by association. In honoring them, he honors the part of himself that yearns for genuine experience, for tests that matter, for stakes that are real rather than symbolic. The first sensation is always the smell. Iron, thick and metallic, mingles with the earthier sense of sweat-soaked leather and yesterday's blood that has seeped deep into the sand. You stir on your straw mattress as the first pale light filters through the barred windows of the Gladiator barracks, and that smell-sharp, unmistakable reminds you immediately where you are and what awaits. The ludus never truly sleeps. Even in the darkest hours before dawn, you can hear the shuffle of feet, the quiet cough of a man unable to rest, the distant sound of a guard's sandals on stone. Around you, dozens of other men begin their day in the same way you do, with the knowledge that each sunrise might be the last they witness from this particular place, in this particular skin. The overseer's bell cuts through the morning stillness like a blade. No gentle awakening here, no gradual transition from dreams to consciousness. The sound is harsh, demanding, and it tolerates no hesitation. You rise with the others, your body protesting with aches from yesterday's training, muscles stiff from sleeping on rough bedding that offers little comfort to bodies pushed to their limits day after day. The morning ritual begins, as it always does. Cold water from ceramic basins splashed on faces still heavy with exhaustion. The shock of it brings clarity, washing away the last wisps of whatever dreams might have offered brief escape. You dress quickly, a simple tunic, rough-woven and practical, stained with the honest marks of hard work. There is no vanity here, no time for the elaborate grooming rituals of free Roman citizens. You are property, valuable property perhaps, but property nonetheless. Breakfast arrives in wooden bowls, a thick porridge of barley mixed with whatever meat scraps the kitchen can spare. It tastes of almost nothing, seasoned only with salt and necessity. But you eat every grain, knowing that your body will demand this fuel in the hours to come. Around you, men eat in relative silence, each lost in his own thoughts, preparing mentally for what lies ahead. The newest arrivals still look shocked, their eyes holding the disbelief of those who cannot quite accept their circumstances. The veterans eat with mechanical efficiency, their faces bearing the calm of men who have learned to save their energy for what matters. You study the faces around you as you eat. There is Marcus, the former soldier who fell into debt and sold himself rather than see his family starve. His hands still carry the precise movements of military training, though his eyes have grown harder since arriving here. Beside him sits Gaius, a Gaul captured in the northern campaigns, his fair hair now cropped short, his proud bearing gradually worn down by months of rigorous discipline. These men have become your brothers in a way that free men rarely understand, bound together, not by choice, but by shared circumstance and mutual dependence. The training begins before the sun has fully cleared the horizon. The practice yard stretches before you, a rectangle of packed earth surrounded by high walls, topped with iron spikes. The sand here is different from the pristine white sand of the great arenas. It is darker, coarser, already stained with the daily evidence of hard work. Your feet know every irregularity of this ground, every slightly raised area where countless men have pivoted and struck and fallen. The lanista, the head trainer, stands at the center of the yard, his weathered face impassive as he surveys his charges. He was once a gladiator himself, successful enough to earn his freedom, experienced enough to know exactly how to forge fighting men from raw human material. His voice carries easily across the training ground, not shouting but commanding attention through sheer presence. "Today we perfect the fundamentals," he announces, his words settling over the assembled men like a familiar weight. The man who grows careless with his basic forms is the man who feeds the sand with his blood. You take your assigned position and accept the wooden training sword, the Rudies, from one of the assistant trainers. The weapon is heavier than a real gladius, deliberately so, designed to build the strength and endurance that might mean the difference between life and death when steel replaces wood. The handle is smooth from countless hands, warmed to a comfortable grip by the sweat and determination of hundreds of men who have stood where you now stand. The first exercises are always the same. Basic stances, repeated until they become as natural as breathing. The weight of the wooden sword in your hand, the feel of your feet finding their proper position on the sand, the way your body must balance and shift to generate power while maintaining defense. These are not glamorous movements. They are the building blocks upon which survival depends. The assistant trainers move among you, their own wooden staves ready to correct improper form with sharp, stinging strikes. They show no mercy to those who slack, no sympathy for those who struggle. This is not cruelty for its own sake, but the hard practicality of men who understand that weakness in training becomes death in the arena. Better to feel the burn of shame now than the bite of steel later. Hours pass in this methodical repetition. Your sword arm grows heavy, then numb, then finds its second wind as muscle memory begins to take hold. Sweat pours down your face, stinging your eyes, but you dare not pause to wipe it away. Around you, other men grunt with effort, their breathing becoming labored as the morning advances. The sound of wooden weapons striking wooden shields creates a rhythm, almost musical in its consistency. But the real test comes when the individual exercises give way to paired combat. You are matched with another trainee, someone of roughly equal skill and experience. The lanista watches these encounters with the keen eye of a man evaluating valuable livestock, noting strengths to be enhanced and weaknesses to be eliminated. This is where the careful choreography of individual training meets the chaos of actual combat. Your opponent today is a man named Lucius, a former baker who somehow found himself here through circumstances he rarely discusses. He has been training for 3 months longer than you, and his movements show the difference that experience makes. His wooden sword comes at you in controlled, efficient strikes, each one designed to test your defensive capabilities while creating openings for follow-up attacks. The first exchange happens almost too quickly to analyze. His sword sweeps toward your head, you raise your shield to block, and the impact sends vibrations up your arm that you feel in your shoulder. You counter with a thrust toward his midsection, but he turns it aside with his own shield and immediately follows with a strike toward your exposed ribs. Your body reacts without conscious thought, pivoting away from the blow while bringing your sword around in a horizontal cut that he barely manages to avoid. This is the paradox of gladiator training. You must learn to fight with complete commitment, while knowing that your opponent is also learning the same deadly skills. Every technique you master, every weakness you discover in your own defense, becomes knowledge that others in this very yard will eventually possess. Yet there is no choice but to train with absolute dedication, because anything less than complete skill means certain death when the games begin. The wooden swords crack against shields, the sound echoing off the high walls that contain your world. Dust rises from the churned sand, creating a haze that catches the strengthening sunlight. Your lungs burn with the effort of sustained combat, but you push through the discomfort, knowing that the man who tires first is the man who loses. Between bouts, you rest briefly, accepting water from clay jugs carried by slaves who serve the gladiator school. The liquid is warm, slightly brackish, but it might as well be the finest wine for how welcome it feels against your parched throat. These moments of respite are precious, not just for the physical relief they provide, but for the chance to observe the other training matches taking place around you. You watch as the more experienced gladiators work with specialized weapons, the net and trident of the Retiarius, the curved sword of the Threx, the heavy armor and rectangular shield of the Murmillo. Each fighting style has its own techniques, its own advantages and vulnerabilities. You study these differences carefully, knowing that understanding your potential opponent's methods could someday save your life. The afternoon brings different challenges. Physical conditioning that would break the spirit of free men becomes routine here. You run laps around the perimeter of the training yard, your feet pounding against the packed earth in rhythm with a dozen other men. The walls seem to mock your efforts, tall and insurmountable. A constant reminder that this small world contains your entire existence now. After running comes strength training lifting heavy stones, wrestling with partners, practicing the specific movements that build the particular muscles required for your chosen fighting style. If you are training as a secutor, you spend time learning to fight with limited vision through the narrow eye slits of your helmet. If you are destined to be a Retiarius, you practice the complex footwork required to effectively use net and trident in combination. The injuries are inevitable. Despite the use of wooden weapons, despite the constant supervision, men get hurt. A poorly timed block results in a broken finger. A slip in the sand leads to a twisted ankle. Sometimes the injuries are more serious. A wooden sword that finds its way past a guard and strikes the temple, leaving a man unconscious and bleeding in the sand. When someone falls, training does not stop. The injured man is carried to the side, where a Greek physician examines the damage with the clinical detachment of a horse doctor. These medical men understand bodies as machines, identifying what can be repaired and what must be discarded. A gladiator who cannot fight is worthless, and worthless gladiators do not eat. You learn to ignore the sounds of pain, the sight of blood seeping into the sand. This is not callousness, but necessity. Sympathy for every injured training partner would paralyze you, make you hesitant in your own combat. Yet beneath this necessary hardness, bonds form between men who share this strange existence. When training ends and the formal discipline relaxes slightly, you see the way experienced gladiators quietly help newcomers, sharing small tricks that might make the difference between survival and destruction. Evening brings a different kind of training, the memorization of combat sequences that please crowds. Gladiator fights are not random battles, but choreographed performances, designed to showcase skill while building dramatic tension. You learn to recognize the signals that indicate when a fight should intensify, when it should pull back, when the crowd's bloodlust requires satisfaction. This theatrical aspect of the games disturbs some men more than the violence itself. They can accept the necessity of fighting for their lives, but the idea of performing their potential death for the entertainment of others strikes them as a degradation too profound to bear. Yet this too becomes part of the routine, another skill to be mastered along with all the others. As darkness falls, you return to the barracks, your body carrying the accumulated fatigue of another day's brutal preparation. The evening meal is slightly more substantial than breakfast bread. Olives, sometimes even a small portion of meat for those who have performed well in training. You eat slowly, savoring flavors that free men would consider barely adequate, but which taste rich after a day of punishing physical effort. The conversations in the barracks reveal the complex psychology of men living under these conditions. Some speak of their families, wondering if wives and children still think of them or have moved on to new lives. Others discuss techniques and strategies, analyzing the day's training with the intensity of scholars debating philosophy. A few plan escapes, though everyone knows such plans are more fantasy than possibility. Sleep comes fitfully to most. The straw mattresses offer little comfort to bodies pushed to their limits, and the knowledge of tomorrow's repetition of today's ordeal makes rest elusive. You lie in the darkness, listening to the breathing of dozens of other men, each lost in his own thoughts, each preparing in his own way for another day, in this cycle of preparation and endurance. Yet even here, in this place designed to break men's spirits and rebuild them as fighting machines, humanity persists. Small acts of kindness pass between gladiators sharing water, helping with equipment, offering quiet encouragement to those struggling with the psychological weight of their situation. These gestures, tiny as they are, become the foundation of bonds stronger than many formed in freedom. The ludus sleeps, but never completely. Guards patrol the walls, their torches casting flickering shadows across the training yard. In the infirmary, injured gladiators rest uneasily, wondering if tomorrow will bring healing or the end of their usefulness. And in the darkness of the barracks, men dream of home, of freedom, of the lives they once lived before the sand and iron claimed them. Tomorrow will bring another day exactly like this one. The same smells, the same sounds, the same grinding routine of preparation for spectacles yet to come. But tonight, in the quiet hours before dawn, you exist in the space between what was and what might be, holding on to whatever dignity and humanity the ludus has not yet managed to strip away. But there was one day when the routine shattered like pottery dropped on stone. One morning when the familiar rhythm of submission and endurance gave way to something that would echo through history itself. To understand what happened in the ludus of Lentulus Batiatus in the year 73 BCE, you must first understand the man who would transform from gladiator to legend in the span of a single desperate decision. Imagine yourself in that same training yard we have come to know so well, but now you see it through different eyes, through the eyes of a man who had already lived more lives than most. Spartacus was not like the other men who found themselves holding wooden swords in the sand of Capua, where others had fallen into gladiator school through debt, capture, or crime. He had arrived carrying the weight of a different kind of defeat. He had been a soldier once, fighting in the Roman auxiliary forces that stretched the empire's reach across distant lands. Some whispered that he had been a king among his own people, the Thracians, before Roman ambition had swept across his homeland like wildfire. Others claimed he had been a deserter, a man who had turned against his Roman commanders when their orders became too brutal to bear. The truth, like so many truths about men who become legends, had become less important than the story itself. What mattered now was not what he had been, but what he was becoming. You watch him in the training yard, and even among gladiators, men selected for their physical prowess and fighting ability, Spartacus stands apart. His movements carry the fluid precision of someone who learned warfare not in the controlled environment of a ludus, but in the chaos of actual battlefields where mistakes meant death for yourself and your comrades. When he practices with his sword, you notice how his eyes constantly scan the environment, cataloging exits, assessing threats, measuring distances with the automatic calculation of a military mind. This is not the focused intensity of a man learning to fight for sport, but the restless awareness of someone who has never stopped thinking like a soldier, never stopped planning for possibilities that extend beyond the next training session. The other gladiators respect him, though respect in such a place carries different meanings than it does in the free world. Here, respect is earned through competence in combat, through the ability to endure pain without complaint, through the small acts of solidarity that bind men together in circumstances designed to isolate them. Spartacus has earned this respect not through dominance or intimidation, but through the quiet confidence of a man who has faced death many times and emerged with his dignity intact. But you also sense something else in him, something that grows stronger with each passing day in the ludus. Where other gladiators have learned to accept their circumstances with the resignation of men who see no alternative, Spartacus carries himself with the bearing of someone who has never truly surrendered. His compliance with the rules and routines of gladiator school seems almost theatrical, as if he is playing a role while his real self remains hidden, planning, waiting. The spark that would ignite rebellion came as such sparks often do, from an act of casual cruelty that finally pushed endurance beyond its limits. The Lanista had decided that a group of gladiators, including Spartacus, would be sent to Rome to fight in funeral games honoring a recently deceased senator. This was not unusual. Gladiators were regularly transported between cities to provide entertainment for various occasions. But the conditions of this particular assignment carried implications that went beyond the normal risks of arena combat. The games were to be particularly brutal, designed to impress the Roman elite with their sponsors' wealth and disregard for expense. The gladiators selected for this event were not expected to provide the usual theatrical combat with its choreographed drama and managed outcomes. They were being sent to die in spectacular fashion, to provide genuine mortal spectacle for an audience that had grown jaded with ordinary gladiatorial presentations. You witness the moment when this reality settles over the selected men like a shroud. In the barracks that evening, the usual conversations about technique and strategy give way to the hollow silence of men contemplating their own mortality. Some write letters they know will never be delivered, final words to families who may never learn their fate. Others pray to gods who seem to have forgotten their existence entirely. But Spartacus does not pray, and he does not write letters. Instead, he moves quietly through the barracks, speaking in low tones with specific men, those whose eyes still hold fire, whose spirits have not been entirely broken by months or years of captivity. The conversations are brief, seemingly casual, but you sense an undercurrent of purpose that makes your skin prickle with anticipation. The plan, when it finally reveals itself, is both audacious and desperate in its simplicity. Rather than submit to what amounts to a death sentence in Rome, this small group of gladiators will make their escape attempt here in Capua, using their knowledge of the ludus layout and their combat training to overcome the guards and flee into the countryside. It is not a sophisticated strategy born of careful preparation and detailed intelligence. It is the raw gamble of men who have decided that death in the attempt at freedom is preferable to certain death for the entertainment of others. The morning of the escape dawns like any other. The familiar sounds of the ludus awakening fill the air, the overseer's bell, the shuffle of feet, the splash of water in washing basins. But beneath this surface normalcy, tension thrums like a plucked string. You notice how the conspirators move through their morning routine with studied casualness, how their eyes occasionally meet across the barracks in brief moments of shared understanding. The opportunity comes during the midday meal, when the guards' attention naturally relaxes, and the gladiators are gathered in the relative openness of the dining area. The ludus of Batiatus was not designed as a maximum security prison. It was a business establishment, built to house valuable property rather than contain desperate prisoners. The security measures that existed were designed to prevent casual escape attempts, not to withstand a coordinated assault by trained fighters. Spartacus makes his move with the lightning decisiveness of a man who has commanded troops in battle. The first guard falls before he can cry out, overwhelmed by attackers who move with the synchronized precision of a military unit. The element of surprise proves crucial by the time the remaining guards understand what is happening. The gladiators have seized weapons and taken control of the immediate area. But this is where the true genius of Spartacus reveals itself. A lesser leader might have been content with the immediate success of the breakout, focusing solely on escape and flight. Instead, Spartacus demonstrates the strategic thinking that would soon make him one of Rome's most formidable enemies. Rather than simply fleeing, the escaped gladiators systematically release their fellow fighters, transforming what began as a small group escape into a mass liberation. Imagine the scene as it unfolds, doors thrown open, chains broken, men who had resigned themselves to captivity suddenly faced with the intoxicating possibility of freedom. The response is not uniform. Some gladiators join the escape immediately, their suppressed hopes igniting like dry tinder. Others hesitate, paralyzed by the magnitude of what is happening, unable to believe that such an impossible thing could actually be taking place. A few refuse entirely, too broken by their captivity to conceive of any existence beyond the familiar walls of the ludus. These men watch in bewilderment as their former companions arm themselves with real weapons gladi taken from the school armory, kitchen knives, tools, anything that can serve as instruments of war. For these reluctant souls, the known horror of gladiator school seems preferable to the unknown terrors of life as fugitive slaves. But for those who choose freedom, the transformation is remarkable. Men who had been reduced to property, who had accepted the daily humiliation of being bought and sold and trained like animals, suddenly remember what it feels like to make choices, to act rather than simply react. The change is visible in their posture, in the way they carry themselves as they take up arms and prepare to fight their way out of the only world they have known for months or years. The breakout itself becomes a running battle through the streets of Capua. The escaped gladiators, now armed and desperate, must fight through the town's hastily organized defenses while simultaneously trying to gather supplies and recruit additional followers from among the slave population. This is warfare at its most chaotic, not the ordered clash of armies, but the desperate struggle of the dispossessed against a system that has never acknowledged their humanity. Spartacus proves his leadership abilities in these crucial hours, while maintaining the tactical awareness necessary to guide his followers through immediate dangers. He also demonstrates the political insight that will soon transform a simple slave revolt into something approaching a genuine war. He understands that their only hope of survival lies not in hiding, but in growth, in becoming too large and too dangerous for Rome to ignore or easily crush. The gladiators fight their way out of Capua and into the surrounding countryside, but this is not the end of their story. It is barely the beginning. Word of the escape spreads with the speed that only shocking news can achieve. In the villas and estates surrounding the town, slave owners lock their doors and eye their own human property with new suspicion. In the slave quarters and work camps, whispered conversations carry the impossible news that someone has actually done it. Someone has struck back against the system that seemed as permanent and unchangeable as the mountains themselves. The initial band of escapees numbers perhaps 70 men, a tiny force by any military standard. But as they move through the countryside, their numbers begin to swell. Agricultural slaves abandon their fields to join the growing rebellion. Household servants slip away in the night to find the rebel camp. Men and women who have never held weapons in their lives take up farm tools and kitchen knives, driven by hopes they had long since buried. Within days, what began as a gladiator school breakout has become something unprecedented in Roman history. A slave army capable of meeting Roman forces in open battle. But this transformation brings new challenges that test Spartacus's leadership in ways that arena combat never could. Commanding disciplined gladiators is one thing. Welding together a diverse collection of escaped slaves, many with no military experience whatsoever, requires skills that go far beyond tactical ability. You can imagine the camps that begin to form in the hills, outside Capua Temporary, settlements that house thousands of people who have suddenly found themselves outside the only social structure they have ever known. Former house slaves work alongside field hands and gladiators, all united by their shared rejection of bondage, but divided by vastly different experiences and expectations. Some want nothing more than to disappear into the countryside, to find some hidden valley where they can live quiet lives away from Roman authority. Others hunger for revenge, seeking to repay decades of humiliation with interest. Still others, perhaps the most realistic, understand that their only hope of survival lies in fighting their way to freedom, quite literally carving out a space in the world where they can exist on their own terms. Spartacus must somehow forge these disparate groups into a coherent force while simultaneously planning military campaigns against the most powerful empire the world has ever known. The man who once held wooden swords in the training yard of Batiatus now finds himself responsible for the lives and hopes of tens of thousands of followers who look to him for leadership in an endeavor that seems impossible by any rational measure. The early military successes of the slave army astonish everyone, including perhaps Spartacus himself. Roman forces sent to crush what officials initially dismiss as a minor local disturbance find themselves outmaneuvered and defeated by an enemy they had not bothered to take seriously. The escaped slaves fight with the desperate intensity of people who know that capture means torture and death, while their opponents often underestimate adversaries they consider inherently inferior. But these victories bring their own complications. Success attracts more followers, but it also ensures that Rome will eventually respond with the full weight of its military might. Each battlefield triumph makes the slave army larger and more confident, but it also makes their ultimate fate more certain. There can be no negotiated settlement with Rome, no compromise that allows rebellious slaves to keep their freedom. The logic of the situation demands either total victory or total destruction. As weeks turn to months, the rebel army moves across southern Italy like a storm, growing in size and power, but also in the magnitude of the response it provokes. Towns that might have ignored a small band of fugitive gladiators now tremble before an army that can besiege cities and defeat professional soldiers. The escaped slaves have become something that Rome cannot ignore, cannot dismiss, and cannot allow to exist. Spartacus himself seems to understand the impossible nature of their situation. In the quiet moments between battles in Martius, those close to him report seeing a man who carries the weight of knowing that he has led his followers into a struggle that can have only one ending. Yet he continues to fight, continues to plan, continues to inspire others with his refusal to surrender, because the alternative accepting defeat and returning to chains remains unthinkable. The rebellion that began with kitchen knives and desperation in a gladiator school has become something that will be remembered long after the last of its participants has returned to dust. The name Spartacus, spoken in the training yard of Batiatus by men who knew him simply as another fighter preparing for the games, will echo through history as a symbol of the human refusal to accept injustice as permanent. But on that first day, in those first hours after the breakout, none of this was certain. There was only the immediate reality of men who had chosen to risk everything rather than accept the unacceptable, who had decided that freedom attempted was better than slavery endured. Their success or failure was still undetermined, their fate still unwritten, their legend still just a desperate gamble taken by people who had run out of alternatives. In the end, what made Spartacus extraordinary was not superhuman strength or military genius, though he possessed considerable tactical ability. What set him apart was his refusal to accept that human beings could be reduced to property, that dignity could be permanently stripped away, that hope could be entirely extinguished. In a world built on the assumption that some people existed solely for the benefit of others, he dared to insist on something different. And so we return to the quiet of your own peaceful darkness, having walked through sand stained with sweat and hope, having witnessed the daily rhythm of lives lived in the shadow of death, having stood beside men who chose to risk everything rather than accept the unacceptable. The gladiators of ancient Rome fade back into history, but their humanity, their struggles, their small kindnesses, their moments of courage remains as real and immediate as your own heartbeat. Perhaps what strikes you most deeply about their world is not how different it was from ours, but how recognizably human it remains. The men who woke before dawn in the Ludus felt the same weariness you feel after difficult days, the same longing for comfort and dignity that drives your own choices. They formed friendships in unlikely circumstances, found humor in dark moments, and discovered strength they didn't know they possessed when circumstances demanded it. The wooden swords have long since crumbled to dust. The training yards lie buried beneath centuries of accumulated earth. and the names of most who lived and died in the gladiator schools are lost to time. Yet something of their experience transcends the particular cruelties of their era. In their daily endurance, in their refusal to let circumstances entirely define them, in their capacity to maintain humanity, even when treated as something less than human, they speak to possibilities that exist in every age. Tonight, as you settle into rest, you carry the comfort of knowing that freedom is not just a political condition, but a state of mind that can persist even in the most constrained circumstances. The gladiators who shared water with training partners, who helped newcomers learn to survive, who held on to dignity when everything else had been stripped away, they demonstrated that the human spirit possesses a resilience that no system of oppression can entirely crush. Sleep comes easier now, knowing that the struggles of the past have given way to the peace of the present. The sand has settled, the crowds have gone home, and in the silence that follows, only the echoes of courage remain. Rest well, knowing that tomorrow brings its own possibilities, its own choices, its own chances to live with the same quiet dignity that sustained those who came before us in darker times. Let their rest be yours. Let their peace settle around you like a gentle blanket, and let the night carry you safely toward whatever dawn awaits.